400 years ago, in a fiercely male-dominated society, the brilliant Padma Cavendish emerged as history's very first female physician. Treating wounded soldiers on the bloody battlefield without any regard for her own life, her supreme dedication and devotion earned her immense reverence and a legendary title. In the present day at the Margot Republic refugee camp, Dr. Aisha diligently checks a smiling child's heartbeat with her stethoscope, prompting immense relief from a bystander noting the child's improved condition. The grateful patient smiles warmly, attributing her recovery entirely to Dr. Aisha's dedicated treatment. A curious colleague asks Aisha if her overseas dispatch to the refugee camp was volunteer work, noting she received a hospital recommendation. Aisha silently reflects on the grim truth that she was merely deployed as a convenient sacrifice. Knowing the hospital administration only wanted to record an achievement in social contribution, she realizes they never would have contacted a doctor who graduated just a year ago otherwise. Walking resolutely through the camp tents, she remembers that watching a documentary about the Republic of Margot is the exact reason she decided to become a doctor. Remembering the indescribable helplessness and anxiety she felt watching their suffering, she bitterly regrets her own immaturity and lack of experience despite her desperate desire to help them. Suddenly, Aisha and her colleague are startled by a noisy commotion outside the tent, prompting the colleague to go check. Armed terrorists violently breach the medical tent with a loud thud, sending a terrified colleague sprinting as he desperately screams for the doctor. Masked men aggressively level their assault rifles at the defenseless medics as panicked screams echo to run. Bleeding and collapsing, Aisha's mind races with agonizing regret, wondering if she could have tried harder or done more. Fading quickly, she violently rejects this gruesome fate, desperately wishing she could have been truly useful to someone before dying. Surrounded by darkness, her final conscious thought is a desperate, silent plea for someone to save her. Suddenly, an inexplicable sensation jolts her consciousness, leaving her thoroughly confused. Awakening to a strange sound she just heard, she gasps softly in total bewilderment. Recognizing the familiar face in the mirror, she freezes in shock because the person staring back is supposed to be dead. Touching her golden hair in absolute disbelief, she struggles to comprehend the strange sound while staring at a face she recognizes from history. She vividly recalls the 17th century legend of the high-ranking noble who broke her engagement to the crown prince at 14, joined the physician corps, and became the first female doctor known as the Angel of the Battlefield. Gasping at her own reflection, the staggering realization hits her that she is occupying the body of Padma Cavendish. The scene abruptly shifts to a rickety horse-drawn carriage rattling loudly across a desolate dirt road in the countryside. Frantically patting her unblemished body, she descends into a panicked loop, repeatedly asking herself what is happening. A sudden jolt interrupts her frantic thoughts as an older gentleman across from her kindly asks if she is all right. Astonished that she feels absolutely no pain and bears no wounds, she clearly remembers the terrifying moment the terrorists shot her. The mysterious older man gently asks if she needs to rest, casually mentioning that they are almost at the crown prince's palace. Peering out the window in mounting dread, she questions the identity of the strange man and internally screams over the total absence of cars, asphalt, and power poles. Staring solemnly ahead, the older man addresses her as Padma and somberly declares that they can no longer see their land. Grappling with the sheer impossibility of her situation, she stammers that her predicament sounds entirely unbelievable. Mentally juxtaposing her past self as Dr. Aisha with her current reality, she screams internally, demanding to know why she became Padma in the first place. As they ride in the carriage, Thomas sympathetically remarks that leaving the palace where she was born and raised must be a terrifying and lonely experience for Padma. He laments that parting with the beloved daughter he raised entirely on his own with his bare hands fills his heavy heart with profound sorrow. Mentally piecing together historical facts, the reincarnated doctor realizes this man is Thomas Cavendish, a palace count and royal medical corps physician who must be Padma's father. Thomas sorrowfully recalls how many times the cruel people around them blatantly questioned if a single father could truly raise a daughter properly. While Thomas explains that the Cavendish family is currently the only one capable of protecting Crown Prince Edward, Aisha internally panics over her sudden transmigration and desperately wonders what happened to the real Padma. Unaware of her internal crisis, Thomas proudly declares that her joining the medical corps as a trainee physician is an absolute act of divine providence. He quickly follows up with a warm smile, acknowledging that her prestigious medical appointment is also clearly the direct result of her own tireless efforts. Leaning forward with a serious expression, he admits his deep distrust of the current medical corps and credits her vital advice for catching Crown Prince Edward's declining health. Startled by the grim news of Edward's deteriorating health, she listens as Thomas instructs her to live by the prince's side and uncover the true cause of his mysterious condition. A sudden spark of historical memory hits her as she realizes that the first prince, Edward Louis Dabley, was famously documented as Padma's very first fiancé. Thomas gravely explains that His Highness has been shouldering the massive burden of governing the kingdom entirely alone ever since King Owen fell unexpectedly bedridden. Connecting the dots, she silently deduces that Edward must be dangerously overworking himself, grimly recalling historical records stating he is destined to die of illness at merely 20 years old. Thomas darkens the mood further by warning her that the Margot family's presence and Prince Harrison's political influence have been alarmingly growing in the background. Hearing that name triggers another chilling historical revelation as she identifies Harrison as the son of the second wife and the future core founder of the Republic of Margot. She vividly recalls the tragic timeline where Padma marries Harrison after Edward's death, only to be subsequently deployed to a brutal battlefield when a foreign war inevitably breaks out. Overwhelmed by mounting dread, she remembers the ultimate horrifying historical fact that Harrison's selfish actions directly caused Padma to be captured and mercilessly executed. The grim historical texts clearly confirm that Padma was taken as a helpless prisoner of war by an enemy nation before meeting her gruesome end. Traumatized by her own recent murder, she desperately hyperventilates over the terrifying prospect of dying horribly on a chaotic battlefield all over again. Noticing her sudden pale complexion and frantic panting, a deeply concerned Thomas leans in and asks if she is truly feeling unwell. Feigning pre-wedding jitters to hide her panic, she manages to calm down as Thomas gently reassures her that the respectful crown prince will treat her with the utmost dignity. He confesses his protective fatherly anxiety about letting his 16-year-old daughter cohabitate with a man, but ultimately relents because she had so earnestly wished for this arrangement. Swallowing hard, the transmigrated doctor realizes she has regressively awakened in Padma's 16-year-old body instead of her historical 20-year-old self. Thomas fiercely declares that they must definitively halt the terrifying diplomatic and foreign advances of the Margot family before this crucial turning point passes them by. She internally connects Harrison's ruthless territorial expansion policies to the devastating, centuries-long conflicts that eventually birthed the modern Republic of Margot where she was originally killed. A heavy wave of sorrow washes over her as she reflects on how Harrison's warmongering left that tragic country engulfed in gunfire and cannons even 400 years later. Observing Thomas's fierce hostility toward the Margot faction, she listens intently as he strictly commands her to relentlessly protect His Highness and support the true royal family. Her mind races back to the history books, recalling how Harrison coldly refused to negotiate for Padma's release because saving a political rival's daughter was considered an annoying burden. Left entirely abandoned by her supposed husband in hostile enemy territory, the original Padma was tragically executed without a hint of mercy. However, a sudden logical inconsistency strikes her as she desperately wonders why a hostile Harrison would ever willingly make Padma his crown princess after Edward's death if he hated her family. An empowering epiphany hits her as she realizes that using her modern medical knowledge to keep Crown Prince Edward alive will ensure she has a legitimate heir to protect her from execution. Aisha realizes that if Padma is truly dear to Prince Edward, he will surely save her and completely alter history in the process. She hopes that if history changes and Padma survives, they might both be able to return to their original bodies and worlds. Staring at the Duke's back, she accepts her duty to protect His Highness, believing it might also change the future of the refugees. Clenching her fists, she firmly resolves to protect the prince. Meeting with the Duke, she humbles herself as an inexperienced 16-year-old girl and politely asks for his kind consideration. The older man solemnly addresses her as Padma while walking away. Closing the heavy door behind her, she silently apologizes to the Duke for not truly being his daughter. Recalling what Thomas told her, she notes that Padma's tall fiancé, Edward, is now 19 years old. Looking at the undeniably handsome prince, she grimly remembers that he is fated to die of illness at the age of 20. Gripping her dress in distress, she realizes that he only has one short year left to live. Determined to use her medical knowledge and historical foresight, she makes saving Edward's life her absolute greatest goal. As the prince turns away, she awkwardly hesitates, internally questioning what part of his body is actually sick. She expects him to politely offer her tea or tell her to rest, but he completely ignores her presence. Breaking the awkward silence, She timidly asks if he wants some tea while he continues scratching away with his quill. The prince wordlessly turns a page as she nervously asks for permission to sit down. Met with icy silence, she wonders if their original relationship was poor or if he suspects her sudden change in personality. Knowing she must carefully earn his trust, she politely asks if His Highness needs anything from her. The 24-year-old Aisha bristles at being dismissed by a teenager, deeply offended by his order to stay put until the head butler arrives. When she asks to walk around a bit, Edward sternly commands her not to wander his palace without explicit permission. She argues that she will be living there and just wants to look around, prompting him to demand why she would wander in the first place. Glaring at her, he coldly states that he will call for her himself if he needs her and orders her not to move. Startled by her sudden request to be called for a medical examination, he looks up from his desk in complete confusion. Frustrated by the tension, she internally begs him to spare her the impossible attitude. Losing her patience, she loudly questions if there is something wrong with him, dreading the thought of building a relationship with such a wretched prince. Edward calmly leans on his hand and retorts that the problem isn't him, but rather her head and personality. Jolted by his sharp words, she fearfully wonders if he is seeing through her to the real Padma. Gesturing to himself, he declares he is perfectly healthy and demands to know her reason for being the only one worrying about his body. Sweating under his intense gaze, she stammers and struggles to find a plausible excuse. Cornered by his sharp questioning, her mind goes completely blank as she realizes she has no good answer. The prince lets out a sharp laugh, gesturing toward her as she stands frozen in the dimly lit study. Clenching her jaw in quiet defiance, she begins to protest. Staring down coldly, Prince Edward sharply interrupts to state that her death would be a massive problem for him. His voice drops into a quiet plea as he asks her to ensure that Padma will not die either. Regaining his authoritative composure, the prince firmly demands that she undergo his medical examination. Without a second of hesitation, she flatly rejects his royal command. Leaning in furiously, she shouts that she has repeatedly refused to be examined by him, while he stubbornly insists she must undergo the procedure. A tense and confusing silence falls as a lingering thought questions why she is so strongly averse to Padma. 3 sharp knocks suddenly echo through the room to interrupt their intense standoff. An unseen servant politely announces from the hallway that the requested room has been fully prepared. Acknowledging his head butler, Edward commands him to escort her away to the designated quarters. Frustrated by the absolute lack of an opening to get closer to the prince, she reluctantly follows the polite butler out. Opening a grand double door with a loud crack, the butler gestures into her prepared quarters and notes its strategic location right next to the prince's bedroom. She gasps in sheer amazement as she discovers entire shelves packed with rare and ancient medical volumes sent directly from her family home. Barely registering the butler's promise to summon her at dinner time, she completely loses herself in her overwhelming desire to read the vast collection. Shaking off her awe, she refocuses on her true priority and concludes that finding a personal medical record is far more important. Searching desperately for any clues regarding Edward's illness, she grabs a nearby shelf and pulls firmly. Opening a sturdy trunk, she reasons that a formal medical record must be hidden somewhere among her belongings. Rummaging through the contents, she realizes that discovering the record is the only way to formulate a proper treatment plan. She knows that unlocking the secret of his condition will dramatically increase Edward's chances of survival. With a sharp crack, she pries open the lid of a beautifully decorated floral box. Instead of medical documents, she discovers a charming collection of trinkets including a beautiful green stone, an unfinished blue ribbon, a cherry pink shell, and a delicate bookmark. Smiling warmly at the surprisingly cute and feminine tastes, she wonders if she has stumbled upon a personal treasure box. Tapping her fingernails against the inner base with a sharp clatter, she suddenly realizes the bottom is impossibly shallow. Prying the base upward with a swift motion, she excitedly discovers a hidden false bottom. Removing the secret panel reveals a scattered pile of pristine envelopes sealed heavily with wax. Picking up one of the items, she notes with slight disappointment that these do not look like medical records at all. Inspecting the smooth paper closely, she finds it highly suspicious that the mysterious letter lacks any sender's name. With intense curiosity, she carefully peels open the envelope's delicate flap to uncover its hidden contents. Scanning the intricate handwriting, her eyes widen as she reads a passionate declaration of a deepening and enduring love for Padma. Blushing furiously at the overwhelmingly romantic words, She covers her mouth in pure shock upon realizing she has uncovered a massive stash of secret love letters. Utterly bewildered by the passionate letters, she finds it impossible to imagine the famously stiff and cold Edward writing such embarrassing declarations about wanting to hold her. She stares in absolute disbelief at the scattered pages filled with intense confessions of unforgettable, true love. Sweating profusely with guilt, Aisha mentally apologizes to the original Padma for snooping through her private correspondence without permission. She stands quietly before an open chest by the window, carefully examining the mysterious contents hidden within. Recalling Thomas's strict warning that this was purely a political marriage to protect the royal family, she logically deduces these hidden letters must be from someone other than Edward. Wondering if Padma secretly loved another man, her attention is suddenly drawn to a strange object attached to one of the documents. She stares intently at the withered plant clutched in her fingers, utterly baffled by its historical or romantic significance. A sudden, jarring transition snaps her back into her modern medical coat, leaving her gasping in shock as she wonders if she has returned to her normal body. Looking around in sheer panic, she realizes she is floating aimlessly in a suffocating void of absolute pitch darkness. Desperate for answers in the oppressive blackness, she loudly calls out Padma's name. She yells into the void, frantically asking what is happening and demanding to know if she has permanently stolen the princess's life. Her panic heavily escalating, she screams into the darkness, begging to know where they are and what this terrifying place is. As a spectral vision of Padma's blonde hair manifests, Aisha demands her location and practically begs the princess to switch places back. The ethereal vision begins to fade away as Aisha cries out the princess's name one last time into the shadowy abyss. A sudden wave of clarity washes over the modern doctor as she begins to understand the true nature of her bizarre surroundings. Floating past a translucent memory of Thomas comforting the princess, she questions if these are actually Padma's personal experiences. Spotting the blue ribbon and the mysterious shell from the treasure box, Aisha realizes she is swimming through an ocean of preserved memories. Swirling amidst the glowing fragments, the stunning truth hits her that she is not in a physical place, but rather trapped deep inside Padma's own mind and heart. Staring in horrified realization, Aisha asks the original Padma why she is cowering and hiding deep within her own subconscious. Suddenly, a voice calling out, "Lady Padma," violently yanks her out of the mental void, leaving her wide-eyed, panting, and terrified. Snapping back to reality in the aristocratic body, she collapses onto the floor amidst the scattered letters, breathlessly wondering if she has returned to the physical world. A servant's sharp knock on the door interrupts her existential crisis, firmly instructing the lady to prepare herself for the evening dinner. Catching her breath, Aisha comes to the profound and comforting realization that the original Padma is actually still alive inside this shared vessel. She understands that the deeply traumatized princess has intentionally retreated deep inside her own heart to completely escape reality. The doctor deduces that Padma is actively refusing to communicate, choosing instead to completely shut herself away from the waking world. Relying on her modern medical expertise, Aisha notes that a mind suffering from such severe trauma can easily resort to extreme regressive behavior as a defense mechanism. Recalling her own dying plea for a savior, Aisha wildly questions if the sheer agony of the moment somehow allowed another person's soul to enter the vacant body. A sudden, chilling revelation strikes her as she wonders if the mysterious voice she heard right before dying actually belonged to Padma. Staring solemnly out the glass window, she deeply contemplates whether it was Padma's desperate soul that actively summoned her across time to this era. Shaking off her dread as the servant calls out again, she quickly apologizes through the door and promises to come out at once. Suspicious of her remarkably changed demeanor, Edward sharply questions her true purpose for being there. The following morning, Aisha confidently approaches His Highness as he sits alone at a large dining table. Holding a strange cardboard tube, she firmly announces her new daily routine of checking his pulse and listening to his heartbeat every single morning. Edward looks utterly bewildered by the sudden mention of checking a heartbeat as she prepares to conduct her physical examination. Leaning in aggressively, she overwhelms the startled prince by claiming she arrived before the wedding specifically to monitor his health and submit daily reports to her deeply concerned father, Thomas. Observing his immediate nervous reaction, Aisha quickly realizes that Edward holds Thomas in incredibly high regard. Reluctantly yielding to the mention of her father's name, Edward allows the examination to proceed right then and there, much to her immense relief. She politely asks him to extend his arm and officially begins the medical examination by carefully measuring his pulse. Edward grumpily extends his arm toward her while stubbornly averting his gaze in annoyance. Amused by his extreme caution, she gently reassures him that she won't attack and internally compares his skittish behavior to a frightened cat. Out of modern habit, she instinctively glances at her bare wrist for a watch before realizing she will simply have to estimate his heart rate manually. Concentrating deeply on the rhythm of his pulse, she determines that his heartbeat does not seem irregular at all. Startling the prince by getting uncomfortably close, she thoroughly checks his neck and lower eyelids, noting perfectly healthy lymph nodes and no visible signs of anemia. Edward aggressively flinches away and complains that she is touching him far too much, leaving her wondering if doctors of this era strictly avoid physical contact with patients. Completely ignoring his loud protests, she firmly grabs his chin and instructs him to open his mouth so she can inspect the back of his throat. She leans incredibly close to peer into his open mouth, mentally complaining that the poor ambient lighting makes it extremely difficult to see anything clearly. After a careful visual inspection, she notes with professional satisfaction that there doesn't seem to be any swelling or erosion of his mucous membranes. Edward impatiently asks if that is enough touching, but she immediately brushes him off and transitions directly to the next phase of her examination. The young prince stares suspiciously at the strange cardboard tube clutched tightly in her hands and demands to know what it is. Aisha confidently smiles and introduces her crude makeshift invention to the bewildered prince as a stethoscope. Knowing the medical tool hasn't been invented in this era yet, she mentally recalls carefully crafting the crude prototype out of rolled cardboard, tight string, and hardened glue. Despite her confident facade, she internally doubts her own craftsmanship, admitting to herself that it is just a plain tube and likely won't amplify any heartbeats. Edward dismissively scoffs that other doctors simply place their ears directly on a patient's chest, while Aisha nervously prepares to test her makeshift stethoscope on his heart and lungs. Feeling completely mocked by his arrogant smirk, she stubbornly powers through the awkwardness and asks him to open his shirt a little for the exam. She carefully presses the flat end of the cardboard tube against his exposed chest and leans her ear in, closing her eyes to listen closely to his heartbeat. Abruptly finishing the awkward front examination, she tells him to redress and firmly requests that he stand up so she can listen to his lungs. Edward loudly demands to know what her ridiculous methods are supposed to achieve as she steps behind him and announces she is going to touch his back. Since her makeshift stethoscope failed completely, she confidently falls back on her extensive refugee camp experience and begins a thorough percussion examination. Skillfully tapping down the length of his back, she happily determines that his lungs and internal organs all seem perfectly fine. Glancing back over his shoulder with a deeply unimpressed expression, Edward sarcastically demands to know what she actually learned from her bizarre examination. Sitting at his desk, Prince Edward laughs dryly and tells Padma that for now they have only confirmed he appears to be in good health. Sighing in frustration, Padma mentally lists the full test panel she desperately wants to order, noting the complete lack of fluid buildup or respiratory symptoms. Impatiently gesturing toward the breakfast table, Edward tells her to stop standing around distractingly and commands her to take a seat. When Padma asks a maid to wash her hands, the offended prince demands to know if she thinks he is dirty, prompting her to explain it is standard post-examination procedure. Her stomach growling embarrassingly as the maid serves bean soup, Padma blushes and admits she is hungry because her nerves prevented her from eating yesterday. Chuckling at her display, Edward notes that it is good she is healthy while she silently curses him for being a vulgar prince. Staring at the hearty meal of bread, eggs, and soup, she struggles to imagine any illnesses caused by malnutrition in the palace. Suddenly, Padma violently shoots up from her chair and screams about anaphylactic shock, causing a deeply startled Edward to choke on his drink. As a horrified servant checks on the violently coughing prince, Padma desperately demands to know if he has a food allergy. Wiping his mouth while glaring fiercely, Edward complains about her sudden loud shouting, but she firmly insists the matter is important. After he denies having any food complaints, she intensely questions if he has ever felt itching or pain after eating things like peaches, shrimp, or crab, warning that severe allergic reactions can lead to death. Blankly staring into space surrounded by floating thoughts, she silently processes the prince's utter lack of allergic symptoms. Resting her chin on her hand, she murmurs in understanding and quietly ponders her next deductive step. Frustrated by the lack of clues, she reflects that a sudden death in an otherwise healthy person feels completely forced if it was not anaphylactic shock. When she shouts that his potential death would skyrocket her execution rate and trigger a war, he coldly tells her to stop pretending to worry about his body. Averting his gaze, he dismissively murmurs that nobody truly knows what will happen. Watching his guarded demeanor closely, she wonders why he is so deeply wary of the original Padma. Unable to find the medical records, she questions what kind of fatal abnormality the original Padma could have possibly noticed in him as a fellow doctor. The tense atmosphere shatters when a panicked servant bursts through the doors screaming that they have a serious emergency. The servant frantically reports to the shocked prince and Padma that Lady Sara has completely collapsed and lost consciousness. Eyes widening in sudden alarm, Edward demands to know why Sara is even here right now. Sprinting toward the garden, Padma urgently asks a servant about Lady Sara's identity and learns she is the prince's cousin. Questioning the circumstances of the fall, she is told that Sara tripped on the hem of her dress and was found lying unconscious face down. Rushing through the grand pillars, Padma asks for the patient's age and is stunned to learn Lady Sara is only 4 years old. Knowing a child's head is proportionally larger than their body, her mind races with the terrifying possibility of a severe concussion from the fall. Edward sprints desperately toward a frantic noblewoman cradling the collapsed child as terrified screams echo through the halls. Arriving at the devastating scene, Edward cries out for his little cousin. The frantic woman explains that Sara fell while running and they quickly turned her onto her back to check her breathing. Carefully inspecting the little girl, Padma notes with intense relief that there does not appear to be any external injury to her head or forehead. Lying motionless on the stone path, the tiny 4-year-old struggles to breathe with shallow, painful gasps. Relieved by the sudden sign of life, Edward leans in close and breathlessly praises the heavens that the young girl is still breathing. Moving quickly to carry the unconscious girl to the palace, Edward is abruptly stopped by Padma, who urgently warns him that she is not actually breathing. Pointing out the terrifying reality of the situation, Padma sharply explains that despite the sounds she is making, the child's lungs are not expanding at all. Staring down at the motionless body, the experienced doctor grimly identifies the terrifying gasps as agonal respiration. Panic immediately sweeps through the surrounding nobles as Padma confirms the child has no pulse and that her desperate gasps are failing to draw any actual oxygen into her failing body. Swiftly analyzing the blunt trauma, Padma deduces that a severe fall directly to the chest has triggered a highly lethal case of commotio cordis. She urgently points to the dark bruise marks rapidly forming on the young girl's delicate skin as undeniable proof of the fatal impact. Wasting absolutely no time, Padma interlocks her fingers and forcefully begins rhythmic chest compressions directly on the child's sternum. Sweating profusely under the intense pressure, she rhythmically pumps the child's chest while frantically calculating exactly how many minutes have passed since her heart stopped beating. Cutting through the hysterical wailing of the desperate mother, Padma fiercely commands the grieving woman to come over and assist her immediately. Looking the terrified mother dead in the eye, Padma aggressively snaps her out of her shock by screaming that her child is actively dying. Tears streaming down her face, the devastated mother drops to her knees and desperately begs the young doctor to save her little girl. Refusing to let the woman succumb to panic, Padma firmly orders her to take over the chest compressions to artificially pump blood through the child's failing body. Guiding the terrified mother with absolute precision, she instructs her to tilt Sara's chin back and prepare to breathe life-saving air directly into her lungs on command. At Padma's fierce command, the desperate mother forcefully blows a lungful of air directly into the dying child's mouth. Urging them to maintain the grueling pace, Padma aggressively commands them to repeat the life-saving cycle while Edward firmly supports the frantic mother. Shoving the exhausted mother aside to reclaim control, Padma violently resumes the heavy chest compressions with a fierce determination. A sudden, miraculous cough suddenly rips through the tense silence as the little girl finally takes a ragged breath of air. Weeping with overwhelming relief, the mother violently pulls her coughing daughter into a desperate embrace. Springing instantly into royal authority, Edward loudly commands his servants to prepare a recovery room at once while the mother sobs uncontrollably over her resurrected child. Completely drained of all adrenaline, Padma heavily collapses backward onto the dirt and breathes a massive sigh of relief that the child is finally stable. Gently kneeling beside the traumatized girl, Edward warmly asks if she is still in pain as she weakly calls out to him as her big brother. Revealing a crushed blossom in his gloved hand, Edward listens tenderly as the little girl weakly explains that she had picked the flowers specifically for him. Offering a devastatingly gentle smile, The usually cold prince softly thanks the little girl for risking so much just to bring him a simple gift. His voice thick with sincere regret, Edward deeply apologizes for being too busy to come see the flowers with her as originally promised. A servant swiftly interrupts to announce the recovery room is fully prepared, prompting Edward to gently promise the little girl that they will speak more calmly later. Edward solemnly bows his head and takes full responsibility for the terrifying accident, formally apologizing to his aunt for neglecting his promise to her daughter. Suddenly shifting her attention to the exhausted savior sitting on the ground, the grateful aunt recognizes Padma as the noble daughter of Court Count Cavendish. Overwhelmed by a mother's boundless gratitude, she tearfully confesses that she has absolutely no idea how to adequately repay the young woman for saving her precious child's life. Clasping her hands in a deeply emotional prayer of thanks, the noblewoman bows her head and expresses her profound eternal gratitude that Padma was there to perform a miracle. Informing the locals that she will return later to check on Sara's condition, Aisha is praised as a blessing who acts almost like a true doctor. Aisha gracefully curtsies to the grateful family as they hold their recovering child close. Outside by the carriage, Aisha is startled when the servants ask where to take her precious luggage, prompting her to instruct them to move it gently to the room. A sudden, loud clatter triggers a violent flashback of the terrorist attack, leaving Aisha wide-eyed and paralyzed with terror. As the servants apologize profusely for dropping the lady's precious belongings, Aisha realizes with horror that she is experiencing a severe trauma flashback. Hyperventilating and clutching her head, she desperately tries to calm herself down by repeating that this is a safe place and not a battlefield. Edward reaches out and repeatedly calls out to her as she cowers and hyperventilates on the ground. Startled by his sudden touch, she screams in sheer panic, causing Edward to jerk his hand back in alarm. Realizing she overreacted, Aisha weakly apologizes for being startled, while a bewildered Edward insists he should be the one apologizing for frightening her. Crouched on the ground, she closes her eyes and forces herself to take deep, trembling breaths to regain her composure. Clasping her trembling hands together, she continuously mutters to herself that everything is okay and she needs to calm down. Finally steadying her breathing, she gathers her composure as Edward kneels silently beside her in the garden. Edward stares intently at her with a serious expression and firmly calls her by her name. He bluntly informs her that there is a specific patient he wants her to examine. Riding together in a bumping carriage, the two sit in heavy silence as they travel to their destination. Edward breaks the silence, revealing that the patient he wants her to look at is actually his own father. Looking forward with a solemn expression, he clarifies that his father is the current reigning monarch, King Owen. He explains that his father has been suffering from severe headaches for half a year, noting that strict information control has likely kept this secret from reaching her ears. Continuing his grim report, Edward reveals that the king suddenly collapsed a month ago and has been confined to his bed, completely unconscious and unresponsive. He adds that the king can barely take soup and is growing visibly thinner and frilier with each passing day. Aisha remembers Thomas also mentioning the king's poor condition and realizes the true gravity of the situation. Edward admits that despite their heavy restrictions on information, it is only a matter of time before the dangerous truth of the king's condition leaks to rival countries. Given how cautious Edward previously was around her, Aisha questions if it is truly all right for her to be trusted with such critical, highly classified information. With a dark, intense look, Edward confesses that the royal medical staff simply cannot be trusted anymore. He explains that the medical staff has pushed them aside to treat the king exclusively, warning that making too much noise would create enemies and hinder their ability to act. Staring at her with wide, desperate eyes, he reveals that this deep mistrust is exactly why he wants to hear her independent medical opinion. Leaning back in the carriage, Edward asks her to determine his father's exact condition and evaluate whether the medical staff's current treatment policy is actually appropriate. Aisha quickly deduces that he wants a second medical opinion and agrees to help, but mentally acknowledges a major complication. She internally panics, knowing that without modern X-rays or detailed exams, she cannot confirm if the king's symptoms stem from a cerebral infarction or a cerebral aneurysm. As the carriage rattles along, Edward suddenly shifts the conversation, awkwardly bringing up the embarrassing incident that happened earlier between them. Sweating nervously over Sara's condition, Padma realizes with mounting dread that she has never seen a medical method where air is blown directly into the chest or the heart is compressed from the outside. Gripping her dress nervously, She wonders if her frantic actions raised their suspicions since the complete method of CPR will not be officially established until 300 years in the future. Breaking the tense silence, Edward sincerely compliments her by stating that her precise judgment and swift action were truly impressive. Looking at her with genuine appreciation, he admits that Sara's life would have been in very real danger if it weren't for her incredible skills and medical knowledge. Lowering his head in a rare moment of vulnerability, the prince expresses his truest and deepest gratitude. Flustering wildly and waving her hands in sheer embarrassment, Padma insists she only did what was obvious, but Edward firmly repeats his gratitude on behalf of his aunt. Staring intently at her flustered reaction, a faint smirk touches his lips as he quietly muses over her claiming such a miraculous act was merely obvious. Flashing a shockingly beautiful smile that catches her entirely off guard, he praises her as a truly reliable person. Later, as they walk through the magnificent royal grounds, Padma gazes up at the towering spires and silently marvels at the incredibly vast scale expected of a king's palace. Following closely behind Edward down an elegant corridor, she glances out the large windows and notes the sheer variety of distinct buildings across the estate. Peering through the glass panes, her eyes are immediately drawn to a peculiar structure with sharply pointed towers. Edward pauses and calls out to her as she stares intensely at the strange building, boldly asking him what the highly suspicious structure actually is. Ignoring her direct question entirely, Edward simply turns his back and commands her to follow him this way. Walking quietly behind him, Padma realizes with a surge of confidence that her modern medical knowledge has finally succeeded in earning his genuine trust. A fierce determination ignites in her eyes as she steels her resolve for the political challenges ahead. Clenching her fists, she silently vows that she absolutely must live up to the heavy trust he has placed in her. Their quiet walk is abruptly interrupted by a sharp-eyed nobleman who cheerfully bids them a good day while mockingly telling his elder brother to take it easy. Freezing in her tracks, Padma stares in absolute horror as she immediately recognizes the grinning man as Harrison. Her mind races with historical facts, identifying him as the second queen's son, Edward's half-brother, her own second fiancé, and the very monster who abandoned Padma and ordered her execution. Harrison's predatory gaze slides toward the trembling girl, his sharp eyes gleaming with an unspoken, sinister intent. Stepping back slightly, a jolt of pure panic strikes her as she suddenly questions why he is referring to her as Padma right now. In a tense flashback, Harrison attempts to hand a sealed document to an Izmir diplomat, only to be sharply interrupted by Edward demanding to know what he is giving away and with whose permission. Gesturing smoothly to the frail, bedridden king beside him, Harrison smirks and falsely claims he has already obtained their father's explicit approval. Edward glares coldly at his brother's sick theatrical display, pointing out the absolute lack of reaction from the comatose king. Defending his overreach, Harrison arrogantly argues that he must make the executive decisions himself because waiting for Edward's formal permission would simply take far too long. Stepping smoothly into the heated fray, an older aristocratic official raises his hands and advises the crown prince that there is no need to be so overly tense. The official, Lord Fisher, deceptively suggests that Edward should rely on Prince Harrison to share the heavy burden of reviewing His Majesty's endless reports. Rejecting the manipulative offer completely, Edward firmly states that there is no need to rely on anyone regarding Izmir's request since it is a complex triangular trade between three nations. Listening intently to the political dispute, Padma mentally calculates that a triangular trade means the kingdom of Dabli should logically receive a commission. Connecting the sinister dots, she realizes with horror that the omitted brokerage fee heavily implies the corrupt Margot family is secretly pocketing the commission instead of the state. Discussing political priorities, Harrison dismissively states that their father's tax reform with the feudal lords currently takes precedence over the Izmir diplomat. Looking over his shoulder, he firmly declares that he will be the one to personally handle the response to Izmir. Walking confidently down the ornate hallway, Harrison clarifies that he is not belittling his brother's domestic law developments. Stopping in his tracks, he bluntly states that the political balance is currently off. Glaring intensely, Harrison warns that focusing exclusively on domestic affairs is a dangerous mistake. He cautions that failing to prioritize diplomacy will inevitably lead to other hungry nations devouring their kingdom. Stepping forward defensively, Edward retorts that they must build internal strength to avoid being devoured and warns his brother to beware of deceptive foreign traps. Bowing with exaggerated mockery, Harrison sarcastically accepts the crown prince's advice with profound gratitude. Smirking haughtily, Harrison questions if his brother came all this way just to bestow such precious words upon him. Ignoring the taunt, Edward suddenly grabs the startled Padma by the arm and pulls her forward. Edward firmly announces that he came to have this specific physician examine their father's deteriorating condition. Sweating nervously under the intense scrutiny, Padma politely bows and expresses her honor at meeting them. The older royal medical staff erupts into absolute outrage, furiously questioning why a mere trainee is being presented as a royal physician. Edward sharply counters Lord Fisher's outrage by reminding the old man that the medical staff themselves recommended her. Maintaining his iron grip on the situation, Edward declares that this girl is meant to be his personal physician. He confidently states that this arrangement was officially confirmed by Count Cavendish himself. When Lord Fisher stammers that it is highly improper for a woman to touch the king's body, a furious Edward demands to know if they purposely assigned him a fake doctor. Wide-eyed and sweating, Padma is genuinely shocked to discover just how aggressively strict gender roles are in this era. A wave of deep irritation washes over her as she recalls that even in modern war zones, no one ever stopped her from treating male patients. Exerting his absolute royal authority, Edward glares at the silenced doctors and challenges anyone to object to the Crown Prince's medical policy. Remembering that primitive bloodletting was commonplace in this era, Padma listens intently as Edward orders the staff to immediately stop draining his father's blood. She mentally reviews the ancient medical texts detailing the archaic belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of the body's 4 elemental fluids. Visualizing the barbaric procedure, she recalls how historical physicians intentionally slashed veins to purge the body of supposedly impure or excess blood. Eyes burning with furious certainty, Edward loudly argues that his father's health visibly plummets every single time the bloodletting is performed. The frail king lies motionless in his grand canopy bed while Edward glares down the incompetent medical staff. Refusing to back down, the Crown Prince firmly commands the doctors to immediately switch to a completely different treatment method. Staring at Edward in profound awe, Padma realizes that this young man brilliantly observes reality and thinks for himself instead of blindly trusting established authority. Desperately defending his archaic methods, Lord Fisher insists that removing excess blood is a highly respected cure for His Majesty's chronic headaches. Dismissing the old doctor's excuses, Edward confidently turns toward Padma and asks her to validate his medical theory. While Lord Fisher scoffs at the absolute nonsense of consulting a girl, Padma thoughtfully concedes that while bloodletting treats polycythemia, it is generally useless. Facing extreme hostility, Aisha shrinks back as the older physician furiously accuses her of spouting absolute nonsense without any medical grounds. Staring in stunned silence, her eyes widen at the aggressive backlash. Stomping his foot in rage, the older doctor berates her as an ignorant girl while proudly defending his widely recognized treatment methods. Dismissing her entirely, the elder brother asks Edward why he would ever believe the amateurish words of a completely inexperienced girl. Stepping forward to defend her, Edward firmly addresses the skeptical men as Aisha nervously stammers behind him. Flustered by the intense pressure, she awkwardly fumbles her words before bluntly asking if the king actually sleeps at night. Edward confirms that while his father remains wide-eyed and unresponsive during the day, he closes his eyes and sleeps naturally when night falls. The elder brother looks deeply confused by the revelation that the paralyzed king still sleeps. Realizing the massive implication of this detail, Aisha gasps as the pieces of the medical puzzle finally click into place. Leaning directly over the monarch, she introduces herself as Padma Cavendish and respectfully declares it an honor to meet him. Noticing his eyes tracking her movements, she eagerly asks the king to blink once for yes and twice for no. Shock ripples through the room as the king slowly blinks to confirm he understands her words. Aisha immediately diagnoses the condition as locked-in syndrome while Edward desperately calls out to his father. Leaning in close, the prince stares intensely at his father's face to verify the miraculous response. Grabbing a pen and paper, Aisha quickly explains that while the king's body is completely paralyzed, his consciousness remains perfectly clear. Connecting the final dots, she asks if the king had been suffering from chronic headaches before finding her conclusive answer. The royals confirm that despite trying every available treatment, the king had violently scratched his head before collapsing unconscious in his office. Sketching a quick diagram, Aisha concludes he suffered a cerebral infarction in the ventral pons caused by a blocked blood vessel in his brain. She grimly explains that the severe necrosis leaves him completely paralyzed except for his eye movements, though all his other senses remain perfectly intact. Edward and his brother listen in stunned silence as she reveals that the king still perfectly sees, hears, and understands everything happening around him. Returning to the bedside, Aisha holds up a makeshift alphabet board and prepares to initiate communication. Hovering the board over the king's bloodletting scarred arms, she carefully positions it within his line of sight. She instructs the king to blink when she traces over his intended letter so they can slowly hold a basic conversation. Tracing her finger across the alphabet, she watches closely as the king blinks forcefully when she reaches the letter E. Recognizing the start of his own name, Edward clasps his hands together in overwhelming emotional relief. Bowing deeply before the bed, the prince offers his sincerest apologies for failing to recognize his father's true condition all this time. Looking for guidance, Edward gently asks if his father has anything he wishes to ask them. Clasping the king's hand, Edward details the smooth progress of their tax reforms before asking for his father's opinion on implementing a new trade tax. Suddenly, a violent strike interrupts the tender moment and leaves Aisha reeling in shock. Screaming in pure rage, the older physician throws a heavy object at them and furiously declares the entire breakthrough to be nothing but deception. Pointing an accusing finger, a furious nobleman violently yells that she is a complete fraud. Shocked and outraged, the man aggressively demands to know what kind of sinister trick she used to manipulate the situation. Despite her desperate insistence that everyone saw the truth, the hostile nobles loudly accuse her of committing the outrageous crime of falsifying His Majesty's words. Standing her ground beside the royal bed, she stubbornly insists that the king is conscious while the nobleman continues to ruthlessly mock her. Gripping her dress in sheer frustration, she screams at the stubborn crowd, demanding to know why they refuse to accept that His Majesty is actually speaking. Watching the chaotic scene unfold, a smirking Harrison asks Edward if his older brother truly believes in such a ridiculous and theatrical act. Biting her lip to hold back her frustrated tears, she firmly vows not to cry as Edward steps in and gently commands her to leave the room. Walking silently down the grand palace hallway, she tightly holds onto Edward's reassuring hand to steady her trembling nerves. Glancing slightly back at her, Edward quietly but firmly affirms that his father is indeed fully conscious. Continuing their somber walk, the Crown Prince reveals that it is absolutely possible to communicate with the paralyzed king. Lowering her head in profound sorrow, she reflects on the agonizing hell the king must have endured being fully conscious yet entirely trapped inside his own silent body. Overcome by the tragic reality of his severe isolation, hot tears finally spill from her eyes as she cries for the silent ruler. Edward gently acknowledges her tears as she laments that the king should have been allowed to feel pure joy instead of facing vicious accusations after finally managing to speak with his son. Pausing their walk in the quiet corridor, Edward turns to her and begins to calmly explain his father's true resilient nature. With a look of deep, unwavering respect, he proudly states that his father remains incredibly wise despite his tragic inability to physically speak. Edward firmly declares that the king is exactly the same brilliant and wise ruler that he has always been since that fateful day. Gazing at Edward's surprisingly gentle expression, she realizes with immense relief that her risky medical intervention successfully allowed the father and son to truly connect. Wiping her lingering tears near the sunlit window, she feels a profound sense of happiness knowing that Edward finally reached His Majesty. Standing close together in the peaceful hall, the two share a quiet, reassuring moment of genuine understanding and emotional closure. Their peaceful moment shatters when a loud slam echoes through the hall, prompting flustered maids to urgently apologize for a window blown shut by the sudden wind. Instantly sensing a dangerous shift in her demeanor following the loud noise, Edward sharply turns and warns her to watch out. Catching her as her body suddenly goes entirely limp, a deeply alarmed Edward calls out her name. Gasping violently for air, Padma clutches her chest in the terrifying, suffocating grip of a sudden panic attack. Trapped in traumatic war flashbacks from the sudden loud noise, her mind races frantically as she desperately orders herself to exhale and remember that she will not be killed here. Moving swiftly to protect her, Edward sweeps the hyperventilating girl into his arms to fully support her trembling, fragile body. Holding her securely, he softly and repeatedly reassures her that everything is okay while instructing her to focus entirely on steadying her erratic breathing. Carrying her away from the startling corridor, he gently places her down on a plush sofa inside a quiet, secluded room. Sitting closely beside the exhausted girl, he watches over her carefully until her desperate panting finally begins to slow to a normal rhythm. Once the terrifying episode passes, A gentle Edward quietly asks if he should have a servant bring her something to consume. Still panting softly but regaining her senses, a deeply exhausted Padma thanks him for his care and weakly assures him that she is completely fine. Lying peacefully in bed, Padma exhales softly as she finally begins to calm down from the chaotic ordeal. She looks up with a guilty expression and apologizes for being such a heavy burden to him. Standing over her, Edward bluntly demands to know what she is actually trying to accomplish with all her reckless actions. He angrily recounts how she avoided him after their engagement, only to suddenly join the royal physicians and recklessly insist on living with him to monitor his declining health. Edward admits he initially suspected her of being a dangerous spy sent by Lord Fisher or Harrison to monitor his every move. Padma gasps in profound realization, suddenly understanding why Edward was being so incredibly cautious about her sudden arrival and demands for medical examinations. Pacing the opulent room, Edward lists her bizarre actions, noting how she antagonized the entire medical council to treat the king and miraculously saved young Sara. Lowering his gaze, he confesses that he even suspected the incompetent medical staff were hired assassins before she intervened. Stopping directly in front of her, Edward stares intensely down at the stunned girl. He bluntly asks if she is orchestrating all of these miracles simply because she wants a massive political favor from the crown prince. Pressing further, he coldly questions if she is trying to strike some kind of grand deal with him. Leaning in dangerously close, Edward stares deeply into her eyes and demands to know her true desires. Internally visualizing a future consumed by Harrison's catastrophic warmongering, Padma resolves to completely rewrite destiny. Staring back with absolute conviction, Padma fiercely declares that she wants Edward to survive and become the king. Startled by her selfless declaration, Edward narrows his eyes and suspiciously asks what she stands to gain from his ascension. Ignoring his suspicion, Padma passionately insists that his righteous rule will fundamentally change the world for the better. Looking down at her from his seat, Edward softly asks if she truly wishes to see a world shaped by his leadership. Without a single moment of hesitation, Padma stares up at the prince and firmly confirms her absolute belief in him. A dark, determined shadow crosses Edward's eyes as he promises to show her that exact world. Tapping his fingers thoughtfully, Edward states that the throne must be officially transferred to him without any further delay. He gravely warns that a dragged-out succession will brutally expose their kingdom's internal instability to hungry foreign enemies. Confused by the political complexity, Padma wonders why the crown prince wouldn't just automatically inherit the throne upon the king's death. Sighing in frustration, Edward explains that the powerful Margot faction is maliciously attempting to force a joint rule with Harrison by questioning Edward's competence. Padma naively suggests asking Prince Harrison for cooperation before quickly stopping herself as she realizes the foolishness of the idea. Edward notes that the hostile Margot faction was never this bold before the king fell into his sudden, mysterious coma. He grimly predicts that his political rivals will soon openly demand his complete removal from the royal line of succession. Gripping his sword hilt, Edward admits he desperately needs more time to solidify his power before the kingdom is torn apart. The young prince closes his eyes, visibly carrying the crushing, unimaginable weight of a crumbling kingdom on his shoulders. Opening his eyes to face the harsh reality, he bluntly asks the transmigrated doctor how long his father actually has left to live. Shocked by the morbid question, Padma admits that the repeated, barbaric bloodletting makes it impossible to give a precise medical prognosis. Recalling historical records, Aisha realizes with dread that Edward only has 2 years left to live before Harrison becomes the crown prince. Staring at Edward's back, she resolves that she has just enough time to try and change his tragic fate. She grimly reflects that even before those 2 years are up, another fatal tragedy is destined to strike Edward. Gazing at the paralyzed king, she laments that preventing dehydration is impossible without an intravenous solution since he can barely swallow soup. Suddenly, a flash of inspiration strikes her as she stands beside an ornate armillary sphere. Startling Edward, she excitedly realizes that a legendary inventor exists in this era who could potentially create an N4 solution and a stethoscope. Edward turns around with a deeply confused expression to ask who she is talking about. Leaning forward intensely, she urgently demands to know the whereabouts of the genius inventor Oscar Murphy. Sometime later, Edward and Aisha desperately chase a fleeing man down a narrow cobblestone alleyway. They finally corner the eccentric Oscar Murphy, who casually throws up his hands in surrender as they confront him. Flashing back to the night she first switched places with Padma, Aisha remembers the overwhelming stress of adapting to her new life. She recalls suffering through a lavish dinner where her sheer anxiety prevented her from eating a single bite. Sitting stiffly at the grand dining table alongside Edward, she was too paralyzed by her lack of 17th-century etiquette to focus on the food. Knowing Edward was suspiciously watching her every move, she feared that raising his doubts would ruin her chances of ever treating him. She resolved to desperately study the era's common sense, from basic greetings to the rigid rules of the social hierarchy. Planning to scour Padma's notebooks for clues, she decided her first priority was getting out of her restrictive dress. Tugging at the heavy fabric in her bedroom, she frantically realized she had no idea how to remove the elaborate gown by herself. A sudden knock at her chamber door makes her jump in sheer terror. 3 cheerful maids enter the room carrying linens and tea to help her prepare for bed. She nervously submits to their pampering as they efficiently strip away her hairpins and tight corset while offering her herbal tea. The maids politely bid her good night after successfully tucking her into the grand canopy bed. Exhausted by the royal lifestyle, she buries her face in her pillow and wonders if she will ever truly adapt to being a princess. Snapping back to the present, Oscar brazenly attempts to negotiate a guarantee of his safety in exchange for his brilliant services. Oscar smiles brightly from the sofa as a bewildered Aisha and a stoic Edward listen to his audacious demands. Aisha stares at Oscar Murphy, marveling that she is actually sitting across from the legendary genius inventor of her history books. She recalls that his countless discoveries and reflective mirrors made him a celebrated historical icon who inspired modern films and observatory telescopes. However, she also remembers the dark historical footnote that he eventually vanished without a trace while searching for a new land. Staring at the smiling man, she grasps the profound gravity of interacting with such a pivotal figure of the past. Edward casually explains that they found the inventor easily because he was already locked up by the church awaiting trial, deeply shocking Aisha. Oscar throws his hands up defensively and cheerfully admits his only crime was publicly declaring that God does not exist. Reflecting on the absolute power of religion in this era, a solemn thought notes that God stands above even the king as an absolute existence within all things. Flashing a carefree smile, the eccentric blonde inventor cheerfully explains that blasphemers are imprisoned by the Inquisition and mercilessly burned at the stake. Casually tossing a small object into the air, he reveals that he only survived execution because the crown prince personally intervened and released him from prison. Edward glares coldly at the strange man and points out that a graduate of the Theological Academy should at least possess basic common sense. Looking slightly embarrassed, the inventor awkwardly scratches his head and admits that he was actually expelled from the prestigious academy rather than graduating. Leaning back on the sofa with a rebellious smirk, he boldly declares that the concept of a creator god is completely unreasonable and entirely useless for understanding the world rationally. Inspecting his fingernails with casual indifference, he claims his only crime was eliminating wasted thought to find the shortest, most logical path to the truth. Staring intensely ahead, he asserts his core scientific belief that absolutely every phenomenon in the world possesses a rational cause. Taken aback by his shockingly modern scientific mindset, Padma hesitantly agrees with his unyielding logic. He sighs in deep exasperation, complaining that the academy professors use God's will as an irritating excuse to avoid seeking real answers. Padma silently realizes exactly why this brilliantly rational man is labeled a dangerous heretic in a superstitious era that blindly blames everything on divine will. Breaking the heavy philosophical tension, Padma pragmatically asks why he refuses to use his incredible mind to create inventions that are actually useful to people. He defensively complains that the priests flew into a violent rage over his mechanical dolls and solar-powered meat roasters because they believed only God could perform such miracles. Intrigued by his bizarre contraptions, Padma curiously asks if the crown prince shares the church's restrictive and aggressive views. Her eyes suddenly sparkle with immense excitement as she eagerly asks the inventor about his mechanical automaton dolls. He enthusiastically explains how he built a highly complex spring-powered doll with the innocent intention of selling it on the street. Padma sweats nervously as he complains about being reported as a sorcerer, awkwardly noting that such a hostile reaction is entirely expected in this primitive era. Realizing the tactical military value of a smokeless solar cooker, she excitedly lists its benefits before noting the obvious flaw of carrying a massive light-gathering mirror into battle. Leaning in incredibly close to a startled Edward, she practically vibrates with excitement as she demands to know if he would fund a miniaturized version of the solar device. Glancing away from her intense and overwhelming enthusiasm, the Crown Prince shifts uncomfortably in his seat. Noticing his subtle impatience, she correctly deduces that the busy royal simply wants to return to his mountain of administrative work quickly. She reflects on the immense burden Edward carries as the acting deputy, single-handedly managing national documents, tax reforms, and law organization while the king remains bedridden. The pragmatic inventor proposes postponing their funding discussion in exchange for seeking temporary asylum in the royal palace until the Inquisition's heat finally dies down. While Edward calmly agrees to the asylum terms, Padma eagerly asks the inventor if he possesses the skill to manufacture her specialized medical tools. Holding up her detailed blueprints, she presents him with the revolutionary designs for a modern stethoscope and fine glass intravenous drip equipment. Pointing directly to her sketch, she passionately explains the exact acoustic mechanics of the tube-like stethoscope required to properly listen to a patient's heartbeat. When he questions why she cannot simply listen directly to the chest, she firmly explains the critical infection risks and the vastly superior acoustics of a proper medical tool. As Edward struggles to visualize a strange rubber tube placed on a patient's chest, Padma confidently confirms that the necessary materials are readily available. The inventor eagerly confirms they can easily import the required rubber tubes from the Hodenberg region while Padma immediately pushes forward with her 4-drip request. The brilliant inventor praises her fascinating medical concepts as she details the precise mechanics of adjusting saline flow and inserting needles directly into veins. Padma confidently plans to order custom glass containers and needles from skilled artisans today to prepare a life-saving saline solution. Edward suddenly interrupts her planning to nervously ask if she actually intends to use this strange contraption on his royal father. Calmly ignoring his blatant apprehension, Padma explains the medical procedure of safely inserting a needle to introduce the saline directly into the patient's vein. A cheerful blonde companion confidently chimes in to assure the terrified prince that the procedure is perfectly safe. Padma firmly argues that the intravenous method is far superior to barbaric bloodletting because it actively replenishes the body's fluids instead of draining them. Sweating under the pressure of this radical new medical concept, Edward nervously asks for a little more time to carefully consider the treatment. Shifting her focus entirely to hygiene management, Padma asks the enthusiastic blonde man if he can reliably manufacture soap and distill alcohol for her. Eagerly taking notes, the blonde man quickly asks her exactly what concentration of alcohol she requires for her medical preparations. Turning her attention back to the room, Padma notices Edward sitting quietly in his chair with a surprisingly calm demeanor. A soft, genuinely warm smile gracefully touches the typically cold crown prince's handsome face. Caught completely off guard by his sudden display of gentleness, Padma stares wide-eyed with a deep blush rapidly spreading across her cheeks. Edward instantly drops his gentle smile and awkwardly glances back at her in flustered confusion. Frantically turning her head away, Padma mentally scolds herself for foolishly overthinking the notoriously rude prince's rare moment of peace. She desperately tries to calm her racing heart by rationalizing that the prince simply looked like he was enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. Regaining her professional composure, Padma formally excuses herself while cheekily promising to make the prince her very first intravenous test subject. Walking gracefully toward the door, she silently reflects on how his typically harsh behavior has noticeably softened since their intense confrontation. A flicker of hope warms her heart as she wonders if the profound psychological distance between them has finally begun to close. Her romantic musings are suddenly interrupted by a voice bringing up the mundane details of their upcoming medical delivery schedule. An older servant politely bows and apologizes for the interruption before officially announcing that a visitor has arrived specifically to see Padma. Surprised by the sudden arrival, Padma immediately assumes it must be another hopeful patient drawn by the widespread rumors of her medical miracles. The servant proudly confirms that a massive influx of female patients has been steadily arriving at the palace ever since she miraculously resurrected young Sara. Handling the situation with practiced efficiency, the older gentleman politely excuses himself to prepare the guest room for the incoming patients. Rising smoothly to his feet, Edward looks down at his designated physician and curiously asks how she plans to handle this sudden medical examination. Thrilled by the prospect of hands-on medical work, the blonde companion eagerly volunteers to assist her by utilizing his extensive knowledge of pharmacology. Flashing a brilliant smile, Padma happily accepts his offer and teasingly tells him to relax his stiff posture as they prepare to leave. Catching Edward's sour expression, The blonde companion cheekily assures the prince that he will not inappropriately stick to the future crown princess all day. Desperately trying to mask his obvious jealousy, Edward stubbornly denies caring and strictly commands Padma not to wander aimlessly around his massive palace. Catching on to his thinly veiled possessiveness, Padma hides a knowing smile as she realizes just how incredibly quick the royal prince is to get jealous. Staring at his flustered face, she finds his sudden jealousy incredibly endearing compared to the viciously hostile prince who nearly bit her head off days ago. The blonde companion bursts into joyous laughter at Edward's transparent shyness while a deeply flustered Padma hastily announces their departure to treat the waiting patients. Anna, Viscountess Roosevelt, introduces herself to Padma Cavendish, who warmly asks how she can help today. Anna explains that she has come to consult Padma specifically about her daughter, Sienna. Observing Sienna's extremely pale complexion, Padma deduces she might have anemia after learning her monthly cycle is very heavy. Anna recalls consulting a male doctor previously who dismissed the heavy bleeding as perfectly normal. Padma expresses outrage upon hearing the previous doctor accused Sienna of lying about her pain and refused to examine her. Catching herself getting worked up, Padma apologizes for startling them and empathetically acknowledges the severe reality of menstrual pain. She taps her own back, sharing that she sometimes feels like her own waist is about to break from the intense discomfort. She explains that the pain occurs during ovulation or menstruation because the young girl's uterus and ovaries are still not fully developed. Leaning in with a reassuring smile, she promises that as Sienna continues to grow, the pain might sometimes disappear completely. Padma clarifies that menstrual pain differs wildly from person to person, debunking the myth that the bleeding is caused by excess energy. She gently asks for permission to touch Sienna's abdomen and requests that the restrictive corset be removed for the examination. After Sienna lies down comfortably on the couch, Padma carefully begins palpating her bare abdomen. While gently pressing on her stomach, Padma reassures the nervous girl that she doesn't feel any dangerous lumps. Returning to her desk, Padma suggests they try a specific medicine to help alleviate the severe cramps. She requests that Sienna keep notes on how she feels once a month while she prepares the medicinal remedy. Stepping out into the hall, Padma asks Oscar if he happens to have a painkiller made from white willow. She excitedly recalls that Western white willow contains acetylsalicylic acid, a raw material for aspirin that has been used as a painkiller since ancient times. Oscar cheerfully confirms he has the remedy and promises to prepare it, leaving Padma deeply relieved. Re-entering the room, Padma enthusiastically encourages the mother and daughter to work together on improving Sienna's health. Later, Anna and Sienna look incredibly relieved and profoundly grateful as they thank Padma for her exceptional care. Oscar notes that as far as he knows, Padma is the only female doctor among the palace physicians. Peeking through a crack in the door, Padma watches the nobles leave and confirms to Oscar that she is indeed the only one. She reflects that even her patients only know of her, cementing her historical status as the first female doctor in the country. Oscar stretches lazily and laughs about his own disdain for rooms full of old men, imagining that working in a male-dominated society must be incredibly hard for her. Staring thoughtfully at the floor, Padma admits that is a question she has been wondering about for a long time. Remembering the intense hostility of the male physicians, she wonders why people who discriminate so heavily against women ever allowed her to join their ranks. Judging by the mundane documents she left behind, she realizes the original Padma lacked any special skills and was merely a trainee despite Thomas claiming her position was earned through hard work. Her deep contemplation is interrupted as both she and Oscar turn their attention toward a sudden arrival. Edward appears with a stern expression, bluntly asking if they are finished with their business. Oscar smirks playfully at the prince and teases him for being jealous enough to come take Padma away. Whispering amongst themselves, the noblewomen dismiss the recent events as a mere coincidence. One woman sharply points out that while Padma is currently just a fiancée, she is destined to become the crown princess in the future. The gossip intensifies as they question if someone of such elevated royal status could possibly work as a common doctor. Glancing toward the towering spires of the palace, they discuss the shocking rumor that little Lady Sara was severely injured. Hiding her face behind a delicate fan, a noblewoman whispers the terrifying detail that the child's heart actually stopped before the prince's fiancé saved her at the critical moment. Astonished by the revelation, another lady gasps in disbelief that the crown prince's future wife is so incredibly knowledgeable about medicine. Using a stethoscope on a patient, Padma remains entirely focused on her work while the oblivious nobles try to recall the name of the court noble's daughter. Sitting peacefully by a sunlit window, Padma diligently records her medical notes with a quill pen. Examining her patient closely in a beautifully furnished room, she ensures the woman is comfortable during the thorough checkup. Pressing the newly manufactured stethoscope firmly against the patient's chest, she listens intently to the steady rhythm of the heartbeat. Pulling back with a reassuring smile, she informs the relieved patient that her condition has significantly improved since she was on the verge of developing pneumonia. Instructing the woman carefully, Padma advises her to continue complete rest and cool the back of her neck, armpits, and groin area whenever her fever rises. Taking off the earpieces, she marvels at how incredibly clearly she can hear everything using the new stethoscope Oscar manufactured. Handing over some fresh cough medicine, Padma firmly insists that the patient call for her immediately if her symptoms worsen even slightly. Fixing her clothes, the patient softly admits that she actually consulted another doctor prior to this visit. Clutching her dress tightly with trembling hands, the woman recalls a deeply unpleasant and uncomfortable experience with that previous physician. Looking at Padma with genuine gratitude, she explains that the traumatic encounter is exactly why she strongly prefers being treated by a female doctor. Coughing lightly into her handkerchief, the noblewoman confesses she specifically sought out Lady Padma for help. Gazing warmly at the brilliant young physician, the patient expresses her profound relief and happiness for consulting her. Stretching her tired arms with a sigh, Padma notes that the unexpectedly long examination caused her to completely miss lunchtime as things finally quiet down. Opening the heavy wooden doors to leave, she pauses in surprise upon discovering a woven basket hanging directly from the handle. Peeking inside the cloth-covered basket, she is delighted to find a fresh batch of perfectly baked biscuits. Entering the bustling clinic room, she cheerfully thanks Oscar for his hard work prescribing medicines while noting the massive influx of patients they handled since morning. Oscar confidently updates her that the essential intravenous fluids are also nearing full completion. A stunned Oscar learns that all of their rapid progress is entirely thanks to the Crown Prince personally negotiating the necessary support so they can finally examine the comatose king. Reading Thomas's urgent letter, Padma discovers that hostile nobles like Lord Fisher are causing a massive uproar, viciously claiming the prince has gone mad and is completely under his fiancée's control just to secure her permission to examine King Owen. Glaring with unyielding fury, Edward fiercely threatens to hold the entire medical staff completely responsible if anything happens to his father, proving he has absolutely no intention of backing down. Smiling at the steadfast resolve of the prince, Padma casually thanks Oscar for the delicious biscuits, only for the eccentric inventor to blankly state he did not leave them. Remembering how preoccupied Edward looked earlier, she quickly deduces that the sweet gift must have actually come from His Highness. Clutching the handle of the woven basket, her eyes widen slightly as she quietly contemplates the Crown Prince's surprisingly thoughtful gesture. Enjoying a peaceful moment, Padma realizes it was actually Edward who secretly brought her the sweet biscuits. A sudden voice calls out to her from across the garden as she relaxes at an outdoor patio table. Turning around in surprise, she immediately recognizes the Crown Prince approaching her. She explains that a servant moved her table outside to enjoy the weather before asking if he just returned from a ride. Sitting atop his majestic steed, Edward calmly confirms that he goes horseback riding whenever he finds free time. Connecting the dots, Padma playfully notes that his hobby perfectly explains why he is constantly wearing riding boots. A brief and comfortable silence naturally falls between the two of them in the sunlit courtyard. Breaking the quiet atmosphere, Edward completely catches her off guard by casually inviting her on a long ride with him. Flustered by the sudden invitation, Padma frantically waves her hands and declines because she literally does not know how to ride horses. Hearing her rejection, the prince averts his gaze and mutters a quietly disappointed acknowledgement. Quickly recovering his composure, Edward smoothly declares that it is perfectly fine because he will simply share his horse with her. Touched by his surprisingly accommodating offer, Padma flashes a brilliant smile and happily agrees to rely on his expertise. An older servant suddenly interrupts the tender moment to announce that a patient has arrived specifically for a medical examination. Preparing to leave for her official duties, Padma turns back to address the prince one last time. Flashing him a cheerful wave, she sincerely thanks him for providing the absolutely delicious biscuits. Blushing and averting his eyes, Edward stubbornly denies providing the treats while Padma internally laughs at his endearing dishonesty. Later in quiet solitude, Aisha reaches out mentally to wonder if she has slipped back into the original princess's subconscious void. Remembering Edward's voice, she tries to initiate a gentle conversation with the dormant soul sharing her body. Reaching into the depths of her mind, she informs the original Padma that they are currently living with Edward at the royal palace. Projecting her thoughts inward, Aisha gently asks if the original princess had a severely negative relationship with the crown prince. She tenderly questions what kind of horrible trauma could have forced the young girl to retreat so completely into the darkest corners of her own heart. Only a faint ghostly hum echoes back from the darkness as the original soul remains deeply asleep. Continuing her one-sided conversation, Aisha admits she initially thought Edward was terrible but reveals he actually provided her a dedicated medical examination room. Staring solemnly ahead, she explains that the patients currently flocking to the palace are all women desperately suffering in silence. She heartbreakingly lists their ailments, ranging from mothers agonizing over blocked milk ducts to young girls enduring severe menstrual cramps. Clenching her fists, the modern doctor laments that in her original timeline, these women would have received proper diagnoses and life-changing medicine. She recalls how modern physicians would offer comforting reassurance and actively work to solve their medical issues together. Her expression darkens with rage as she describes how the incompetent doctors of this era dismiss female pain as divine punishment and absolutely refuse to listen. Furious at the systematic misogyny, she mentally vents about how male doctors force women to simply endure their suffering without ever attempting a real diagnosis. A sudden drop of sweat rolls down her face as she awkwardly realizes her angry description of arrogant men sounds exactly like Edward's original behavior. Oscar prescribes the medicine while Edward provides the necessary funding. Padma excitedly declares that they will soon be able to prepare 4 fluids and promises to teach him how for the patient's sake. She marvels at how easily Oscar manufactured the stethoscope despite all the historical hardships she previously endured. Flashing back to her childhood, she remembers being terrified by a documentary about a Margot Republic refugee camp which ultimately inspired her to become a doctor. Wide-eyed with lingering trauma, she recalls the intense emotions of that defining moment. A young Aisha clutches a pillow tightly as a sharp feeling of anxiety and impulsiveness washes over her. Unable to sit still or remain calm, she agonized over why such terrible suffering was happening in the world. She solemnly wonders if she might have belonged to that war-torn country in a previous life. Fast-forwarding to her time at the camp, a defeated Aisha slumps against a wall, overwhelmed by her immature skills and incomplete medical knowledge. Suddenly gripping her pant leg in determination, her tearful eyes sharpen with fierce resolve. Standing tall in her medical coat, she boldly declares that she will never run away even if she cannot instantly heal everyone. She fiercely vows to grasp every desperate hand that reaches out to her and struggle alongside her patients until the very last moment. Clenching her fists, she swears to fight fate itself to search for a path to life for any patient wishing to survive. Returning to the present, Padma gazes firmly at Edward and states her absolute desire to save him. Leaning slightly forward, she asks if he was the one who called out to her during her dying moments. Remembering the gunshot, she connects the mysterious girl's voice she heard in the medical tent to her current reality. She warmly encourages him to think about the situation together and gently asks what hurt him. Gripping her collar tightly, she silently processes the immense weight of her dangerous mission. Staring down resolutely, she accepts her profound duty to let the identity of Padma save Edward. Living alongside the prince, she admits her heart is often moved by his sincerity as his faction gradually expands its political influence. Recognizing Edward as the lonely defender and the very future of the country, she internalizes him as her greatest hope. Turning her back to the shadows, she solemnly acknowledges that she does not truly belong to this era and is not the real Padma. Tearfully resting her head, she mentally begs the universe to let her save Edward and rewrite his tragic future. Trembling slightly, she confesses her deep-seated fear of the ruthless Prince Harrison. A dark shadow looms over her thoughts as she shudders at the terrifying prospect of Harrison seizing the throne. Suddenly, a booming voice shatters her thoughts as a lightning flash illuminates the room, asking if Harrison did something to her. Startled out of her mind, Padma lets out a piercing scream as she jumps back. Tripping over herself in blind panic, she crashes hard onto her opulent canopy bed. A sudden, firm hand grabs her arm in the darkness, leaving her gasping in sheer confusion. Pinned down on the mattress, she screams in terror as Edward desperately shouts her name. Gasping violently for air, Padma stares in utter panic as Edward firmly orders her to calm down. Trembling uncontrollably, she struggles to form coherent words through her suffocating panic. Edward gazes down at the terrified girl with profound, silent concern. Gripping her dress, she confusingly asks him why he is here. Looking away slightly, Edward admits he grew worried when the thunder started rumbling because he knows she cannot handle loud noises. Staring up at him in pure shock, she quietly realizes he came solely out of concern for her well-being. Moving swiftly, Edward pulls the startled girl firmly into a protective embrace. Holding her tightly, he gently but persistently reassures her that the loud booms are just thunder and not the terrifying sound of airstrikes. Glancing out the window at the raging storm, he continues to ground her by emphasizing that she is only hearing the rain rather than machine gun fire. Resting his chin against her head, he softly asks the trembling girl if she is scared. Her mind races with scientific facts about static electricity discharging in cumulonimbus clouds as she desperately tries to convince herself there is nothing to fear. Despite her rational logic, she ultimately surrenders to her trauma and admits that the noise is genuinely terrifying. Trapped in agonizing memories, she vividly recalls the paralyzing fear of her past and her desperate, overwhelming desire not to die. Clenching her fists, she silently vows that as long as she can hear patients crying for help, she must fulfill her mission to be useful to someone. Reaffirming her absolute dedication as a doctor, she resolves to keep fighting and doing everything possible to hold her patient's hands. Burying her face into his chest as the storm rages outside, she finally breaks down and confesses out loud that her fear is completely unbearable. Clutching his shirt desperately, she admits her deepest, most terrifying anxiety that she might simply disappear and fade away. Her internal monologue reveals her constant horror over instinctually reaching for modern light switches or non-existent phones, serving as terrifying reminders of her displaced soul. Grappling with her dual existence, she silently agonizes over being Aisha Reed forced to live, act, and struggle to change the future entirely as Padma Cavendish. While Edward softly reassures her that everything is all right, she silently questions what will ultimately become of her fragmented identity. Cutting through her spiraling panic, Edward gently instructs her to focus entirely on the steady sound of his heartbeat. Tears streaming down her face, she echoes his words in mild confusion as she processes the intimate request. A soft smile touches his lips as he points out she hears it every morning, softly questioning why she cannot recognize the rhythm tonight. Tightening his protective grip, he holds her securely against his chest so she can feel his steady life force. Shushing her gently over the roaring storm outside, he repeats his calming command to just listen to his heart. Embracing her frail, trembling body, he provides a profound sense of safety by declaring that it is okay because she is right here in his arms. Burying his face into her hair, he firmly banishes her existential dread by affirming that in his embrace, she is truly and genuinely alive. Grounded by his warmth, her mind drifts back to the tragic day she was fatally shot by a terrorist in the medical tent before mysteriously awakening as Padma. Holding her in a deeply comforting embrace, Edward softly promises that she will remain by his side in the country where he is destined to become king. Whispering comforting words into the quiet room, he vows to always be there and urges her to let go of all her worries. As the morning sun rises over the grand palace, an urgent knocking echoes down the hall as a servant repeatedly calls out for the young lady. The frantic knocking continues to resound through the heavy wooden door while Padma remains blissfully asleep. Beside her in the quiet room, Crown Prince Edward sleeps deeply with a peaceful expression completely devoid of his usual royal stiffness. The engaged couple rests comfortably side by side in the massive bed under the warm morning light. A servant suddenly pushes the door open to apologize for the intrusion, causing Padma to jolt awake with a terrified scream. Frantically clutching her blanket in utter shock, Padma completely panics while a groggy Edward slowly rubs the sleep from his eyes. Edward casually admits to falling asleep exactly as he was while the older servant sternly reprimands the prince for inappropriately spending the night in his fiancée's bedchamber. Ignoring Edward's tired insistence that absolutely nothing happened, the servant strictly lectures the couple about maintaining decorum befitting the future king. Checking herself in sheer panic, Padma breathes a massive sigh of profound relief upon realizing they are both still completely fully clothed. Glaring at his judgmental servant, Edward furiously explains that he only entered her room because the young doctor was utterly terrified of the roaring thunder. A deeply flustered Padma wildly attempts to clear up the scandalous misunderstanding while an irritated Edward aggressively yells at his servant to shut up. After the chaos settles, Edward turns to a startled Padma and gently requests that she simply call him Ed from now on. He playfully reasons that she is far too stubborn to ever bother remembering proper royal titles like Your Highness anyway. Staring deeply into her eyes, he softly commands her to call his name immediately whenever loud noises frighten her in the future. Flashing a devastatingly handsome smile, Edward cheekily promises to come running to her rescue as long as he feels like it. Lying comfortably back in bed while clutching her pillow, Padma gazes at the ceiling and wonders if the prince will actually keep his promise. A warm feeling spreads through her chest as she realizes he no longer shouts at her or tells her to simply endure her fears. Instead of ignoring her pain, she marvels at the heartwarming truth that the once cruel prince now fully intends to run to her side. Meanwhile, in another part of the castle, Prince Harrison leans heavily against his hand with a dangerously dark expression. Sitting regally before a grand fireplace, Harrison coldly glares at his subordinate and dismissively refers to Padma as a foolish little girl. He bitterly acknowledges to his loyal subordinate that Padma intentionally entered the crown prince's quarters despite having already agreed to their secret deal. The older subordinate respectfully reports that an intended item sent with a letter will be utilized later while confirming the king remains successfully deceived. Harrison narrows his sharp eyes with intense suspicion and quietly questions if the dangerous item was actually used. Utterly furious at the unexpected turn of events, the scheming prince clicks his tongue and viciously curses Padma's name. He admits to his subordinate that he momentarily feared their grand conspiracy had been completely exposed when Edward suddenly brought Padma into the king's royal bedroom. Staring intently at a partially decoded letter, Harrison expresses absolute disbelief that his supposed pawn actively chose to take his brother's side. He angrily recalls that Padma was merely a dissatisfied political stake who ambitiously wanted to practice medicine instead of becoming the crown prince's obedient bride. Harrison reflects on how effortlessly he manipulated the sharp-tongued but sheltered princess by luring her in with enticing bait and impossibly sweet words. Clutching the damning document in his hands, he genuinely struggles to understand why she would suddenly betray him after completely falling for his manipulations. Smiling with arrogant certainty, Harrison confidently asserts that stealing the deeply infatuated girl from his brother had been a doubly satisfying victory. Sneering with contempt, Prince Harrison mocks Edward as a fool clinging to the obsolete Dabley royal family and claims House Margot is the only faction truly capable of making the country prosper. He coldly reflects that he originally planned to use Padma to sway the court count's faction to his side. Looking utterly bored, he casually admits he never actually cared about the girl in the first place. A dark smile crosses his face as he resolves to simply dispose of her along with the others if she becomes an obstacle. Continuing his sinister monologue, Harrison casually suggests getting rid of his own father as well. He notes that if the paralyzed king actually heard and remembered their treasonous conversation, he will inevitably become a nuisance. Glaring with absolute malice, the ruthless prince officially decides to eliminate them both. He easily justifies his impending patricide by reasoning that everyone goes to the next world eventually anyway. Crushing a fallen flower beneath his spurred boot, he declares their time will simply come a little earlier than planned. Later that evening, Padma and Edward stand side by side in formal attire at a grand, bustling social gathering. Gazing around the opulent hall, Padma marvels at the lavish birthday banquet thrown for the border marquis and the high-ranking feudal lords in attendance. Edward's eyes narrow as he observes a suspicious number of guests from the kingdom of Russia, deducing their presence is tied to Harrison rather than the marquis. Glancing over the crowd, the prince grimly notes that this troubling connection likely implicates Lord Fisher as well. Recalling their earlier medical preparations, Padma remembers confirming the intravenous saline solution is finally ready should King Owen lose his ability to swallow entirely. The brief flashback ends as another noble approaches Thomas and politely asks to speak with him in private. Edward leans in and suggests it would be wise for Padma to properly greet Lord Fisher since he is also attending the party. Relieved to finally spot him, Padma eagerly approaches Lord Fisher to propose her revolutionary treatment plan for His Majesty. Observing Edward from afar, the older man warmly notes the prince's deep affection for Padma and pledges his full support. Encouraged by his backing, Padma internally resolves to solidify the real Padma's legacy by implementing her medical advancements as soon as possible. She strategizes that her immediate priority is convincing Lord Fisher to abandon archaic bloodletting in favor of her modern treatments. Searching the crowded halls, she momentarily loses sight of Lord Fisher and wonders if he slipped into another room. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echo behind her as an ominous voice bids her a chilling good evening from the shadows. Turning around, Padma comes face to face with Prince Harrison looming at the bottom of the grand staircase. Deeply unsettled by his unusually formal demeanor, she stiffly returns the greeting while attempting to maintain her composure. Stepping aggressively into her personal space, Harrison demands to know if she realizes exactly what she is doing right now. Trapping her against the wall, he glares down and dangerously whispers that it took her far too long to carry out his orders. Leaning in with a predatory smirk, the prince accuses the terrified girl of trying to take advantage of him. Trembling and utterly confused, Padma stammers helplessly as he asks if she genuinely thought she could run away from him. Shaking with fear, she desperately argues that the terrifying amount of poison he provided is entirely different from what he initially ordered. Grabbing her violently, Harrison pulls her close and confirms with chilling finality that he intentionally gave her a lethal dose. Gasping in shock, Padma suddenly realizes her voice is slipping out on its own, sounding entirely different from what she remembers and confirming this is not truly her body. Panicking over the unfamiliar voice, she silently wonders who would be devastatingly implicated if this strange secret were ever exposed to the royal court. Glaring intensely, a furious man suddenly corners her and violently accuses Padma of deliberately deceiving him. Stepping back in sheer horror, she watches as the cold-eyed nobleman aggressively confronts her in the grand hallway. Clutching her throbbing head, she desperately tries to process the bizarre and threatening exchange that just occurred. Her mind races in absolute terror as she realizes the lethal dose of the mysterious substance is completely different from what she was originally told. Trembling in the quiet corridor, she frantically asks herself what the original Padma actually received from these dangerous conspirators. She suddenly recalls a highly cryptic letter granting her full permission to act as she saw fit regarding the sinister matter. Grappling with the terrifying implications of a lethal dose, she struggles to comprehend the true deadly nature of the item she supposedly possesses. Narrowing her sharp focus, she realizes the scheming Lord Fisher is standing at the very center of this dark political plot. Deducing that Fisher is the true ultimate threat, she concludes there is no way to confirm the deadly intention without possessing the actual tree root mentioned in the secret letter. Approaching the incredibly stubborn Lord Fisher directly, she boldly proposes a revolutionary new medical treatment for the comatose king. Looking absolutely determined, she confidently announces to the skeptical royal physicians that she has successfully prepared a specialized intravenous solution. Fisher stares in utter bewilderment as she explains her radical plan to introduce vital fluids directly into the king's body using a hollow medical needle. She expertly details the delicate process of inserting the needle into a vein while simultaneously stimulating the paralyzed patient's swallowing reflexes. Outraged by her modern medical methods, the ignorant Lord Fisher violently mocks her by insisting that dirty blood must simply be regularly drained from the body. Glaring down at the brilliant young doctor, Fisher stubbornly accuses her of recklessly introducing dangerous impurities straight into the royal bloodstream. Standing her ground against his immense ignorance, she fiercely shouts that the life-saving fluids are absolutely not dangerous impurities. Ignoring his dismissive sneers, she passionately argues that the physiological saline solution will safely and effectively cure the king's severe dehydration. Leaning in with a vile mocking smirk, the cruel lord degrades her incredible medical skills as nothing more than a foolish amateur playing doctor in the palace. Clenching her fists in furious frustration, she realizes these incredibly stubborn nobles completely refuse to even try to understand her life-saving modern science. Driven by pure righteous anger, she fearlessly demands to know why the cowardly royal physicians refuse to face their suffering patients honestly. She passionately challenges the corrupt doctors to actually listen to their desperate patients and work together to find the true cause of their immense agony. Disgusted by their primitive medieval superstitions, she violently condemns them for dismissing real agonizing pain as mere lies or divine punishment. Refusing to back down against the furiously screaming crowd, she loudly reminds them that their entire medical education should be entirely dedicated to freeing people from pain. The confrontation erupts into absolute chaos as a screaming Fisher horribly degrades women as inherently impure creatures cursed entirely by divine punishment. Defying his vile misogyny completely, she fiercely challenges the entire room to remember the true sacred purpose of the medical authority bestowed upon them. Standing proudly by her unwavering medical ethics, she fiercely declares she has said absolutely nothing wrong while Edward calmly observes the intense argument. Slicing through the heated screaming with cold royal authority, Edward smoothly reminds everyone that they are currently standing in the middle of a grand birthday celebration. Taking absolute control of the chaotic scene, the Crown Prince calmly commands the flustered nobles to take their loud medical disputes elsewhere to avoid ruining the party. Tearfully apologizing, Padma realizes that they simply want to shut her down and sweep the entire matter under the rug. Surprised by the accusation of indulging his fiancée Padma, Edward listens as Lord Fisher steps forward to seize the opportunity to speak his mind. Fisher condescendingly demands that the prince stop Padma before she embarrasses herself further by waving around fragmented medical knowledge and gathering women to play doctor. The old lord continues his misogynistic rant, declaring that nothing but trouble arises when a woman acquires knowledge because she grows intoxicated with power and forgets her place. Scoffing at her defiance, Fisher claims she is dangerously deluded into thinking she is equal to a man and capable of living independently when her place is strictly in the home. He further questions her qualifications to even be the crown princess, arguing that she desperately needs to be taught obedience and gentleness rather than interfering with men's work. Stepping forward with a commanding presence, Edward firmly interrupts the old man's tirade by declaring that this is not a matter of man or woman. The crown prince rationally counters that acquiring knowledge and experience is a virtue for any human being because it ultimately brings wealth and technology to their nation. Leaving the old doctor stunned, Edward confidently asserts that there is absolutely no clause in their country's laws forbidding women from receiving an education or utilizing their skills. Glaring coldly at Lord Fisher, the prince reminds him that as someone reasonably well-versed in the law, he certainly does not recall any such restrictive legislation. Watching Edward bravely defend her with calm rationality, Padma wonders with awe why women were ever forbidden from possessing the same knowledge as men in the first place. Refusing to let the insults slide, Edward raises his voice and fiercely demands a clear explanation from Fisher for the derogatory comments he just made. Suddenly, a group of noblewomen steps forward from the crowd, politely interrupting the tense standoff to admit they had been listening to the entire conversation. Padma watches in breathless surprise as the elegant women gather together to make their voices heard. Introducing herself as Anna Roosevelt, the lead noblewoman reveals that she, her daughter Sienna, and everyone standing with her are actually patients receiving care from Lady Padma. Glaring disdainfully at Lord Fisher, another woman sharply asks the old doctor if he even remembers who they are. Standing united, the group of noblewomen shockingly reveals that all of them were originally Lord Fisher's own patients. Covering her smirk with a fan, Lady Roosevelt reminds the stunned old man that they left his care because he never even bothered to properly examine them. Another woman awkwardly interjects to correct Lady Roosevelt, pointing out that Fisher actually did perform a physical examination on them. Frowning with visible discomfort, she accuses the old doctor of inappropriately pressing his ear against her chest and touching her insistently during his supposed treatments. Casting a dangerously dark glare at the sweating doctor, the Crown Prince coldly states that he will be hearing the full details of those highly inappropriate examinations later. The women praise Lady Padma for genuinely listening to their concerns, explaining the true condition of their bodies, and kindly promising to work toward their recovery together. Highlighting the undeniable effectiveness of Padma's medicines, they passionately describe how she never mocked them and patiently drew diagrams to ensure they understood their own health. Stepping up with renewed confidence, Padma enthusiastically explains her methodology of calculating precise dosages by body weight and extracting ingredients through steam distillation so that anyone can safely prescribe medicine. A noblewoman chuckles in agreement, noting the vast and honorable gap between Padma's desire to educate everyone and those selfish individuals who hoard knowledge for themselves. Gripping her fan tightly, the woman scathingly condemns corrupt traditional doctors who monopolize medical knowledge and exclusively use it on a select few patients they personally favor. The women proudly declare that Lady Padma bravely took the vital medical knowledge that men had unfairly monopolized and finally returned it to the women who desperately needed it. They furiously remind Lord Fisher of how traditional male doctors completely refused to examine them, dismissing their pain by simply stating there was nothing they could do because they were women. Stepping fiercely toward the flustered old men, the noblewoman demands to know if they intend to conduct proper examinations in Padma's place now that they dare to accuse her of just playing doctor. Seizing the ultimate victory in the argument, Edward sharply demands to know how Lord Fisher can possibly explain away the undeniable fact that Padma's mocked actions have actively saved so many lives. An older nobleman sternly defends Lady Padma, reminding her detractors that women make up half the world and asserting their own firm stance on her right to treat patients. He fiercely shuts down the argument, warning the opposition not to come crying for help later if they insist on taking such foolish responsibility. Edward, Padma, and a noblewoman watch in awed silence as the fierce defense unfolds before them. Turning to Edward, Padma expresses her deepest gratitude, though the bewildered prince questions what he actually did to help. She gently reminds the confused prince that he was the one who initially confronted the hostile crowd. The noblewoman warmly adds that his critical intervention gave them the courage to speak up, praising his reassuring words. She confesses that his progressive declaration about knowledge belonging to all humans, regardless of gender, deeply touched her heart. Fanning herself with a bittersweet smile, she reflects on how they have historically been treated merely as women rather than true human beings. Padma stares intently, silently acknowledging that while gender discrimination existed in her own era, the reality here is far more severe. She grimly realizes that in this harsh historical period, such prejudice actively controls lives and violently strips away fundamental human rights. Edward reacts with shocked indignation when the noblewoman teasingly asks if his progressive ideals were heavily influenced by Lady Padma. Flustered, Padma immediately denies having any such influence, insisting he was already remarkably open-minded from their very first meeting. Gripping his arm affectionately, she proudly declares that the prince discerns good and evil entirely unbound by prevailing customs while earnestly considering the nation's future. She softly adds that Edward is a man who truly understands exactly what must be done for his people. Continuing her heartfelt praise, she emphasizes his tireless dedication to enacting vital laws and protecting what truly matters to the country. Flushing a deep shade of red, a highly embarrassed Edward coughs into his hand and stammers that she is overestimating him far too much. The noblewoman beams at their dynamic, praising them as a beautifully matched couple who deeply understand each other. Padma's mind drifts to a sweet realization as she confirms a maid's rumor that Edward secretly left a bag of treats on her door handle during a stressful examination. Her tender thoughts are interrupted as a distinguished older gentleman approaches the group and greets the prince. The man bows respectfully and formally introduces himself as Macloy Roosevelt to the attentive prince. Expressing a profound interest in the prince's nation-building plans, Macloy politely asks for a moment of his time to discuss future laws and innovative ideas. Edward readily agrees to the conversation as the older noble actively requests his political support. Gesturing across the grand hall, Edward calmly invites Macloy to discuss the matters privately alongside Thomas. Watching the men walk away, Padma feels a surge of genuine relief that their political momentum is finally moving in a highly positive direction. She realizes with budding hope that securing even one more powerful supporter could dramatically shift the scales in Edward's favor. Smiling softly to herself, she resolves that nothing would make her happier than personally contributing to his ultimate success. Suddenly surrounded by a group of grateful noblewomen, Padma listens as they express their absolute deepest thanks. Overwhelmed by their unexpected devotion, Padma emotionally urges the women to raise their heads. One of the noblewomen places a hand over her heart, reaffirming their profound and unwavering gratitude for everything she has done. Tears of sheer joy prick Padma's eyes as the women crowd around her with boundless, heartfelt appreciation. Glancing around the crowded, chandelier-lit hall, Padma wonders where Edward could possibly be and if he is still caught up in discussion. Her eyes softening with quiet determination, she reflects on her strong desire to finally thank him. She hesitates slightly, acknowledging that tracking him down might be difficult since he is such a well-known figure. Comparing his current environment to the royal castle, she notes how he is completely isolated in the Grand Assembly Hall despite previously seeming at ease among close attendants. Staring intently at the floor, she corrects herself by realizing he was actually deliberately isolated by his political enemies. She feels a surge of hope as she notes that people are slowly gathering around him again thanks to King Owen's recovery and the growing support for his tax reforms. Watching the surrounding noblewomen, she assumes he will inevitably be drawn into yet another exhausting conversation even after he finishes speaking with the Roosevels. A sudden, sparkling mental image flashes before her eyes, depicting a dashing Edward completely surrounded by adoring women. Shaking her head violently to dispel the bizarre thought, she quickly concludes it is utterly impossible for such a sharp-tongued, ill-tempered man to attract a swarm of ladies. Touching her delicate necklace, she grounds herself and refocuses on finding the elusive crown prince. She logically deduces that if he were actually surrounded by a crowd of women, his presence would stand out far too much to miss. Suddenly, a hand darts out from behind the heavy curtains to grab her wrist, making her gasp in shock as she realizes he is hiding on the balcony. Pulled swiftly into the shadows, she calls out his name in sheer surprise as Edward's intense gaze locks onto hers. He holds her firmly against his chest in the secluded space, his serious demeanor softening in her presence. Just inches away, the loud, obnoxious chatter and laughter of the oblivious nobles echo brightly through the grand hall. Glancing nervously at the curtain's edge, she asks where he has been hiding since she was desperately searching for him. Pulling her into a secure embrace, Edward sighs deeply and honestly admits that the suffocating noise outside was simply unbearable. When he gently asks about her own tasks, she assures him that she has finally finished everything she needed to do. He bitterly complains about how a simple session listening to patients quickly devolved into an exhausting meeting of concerned political parties. Holding her tight, he expresses profound relief and suggests they rest together for a bit since no one will dare interrupt them here. Her heart pounding loudly in the quiet space, she nervously breaks the silence to express her sincere gratitude. Looking up at him earnestly, she thanks him for fiercely confronting the stubborn Lord Fisher earlier that day. Smiling down at her, Edward gently dismisses her thanks by stating there was no need since the corrupt nobles were clearly just trying to embarrass her. He reveals their sinister plot to humiliate him in front of powerful foreign lords by framing him as an idiot subservient to an obscure female doctor, perfectly timing it for Harrison's arrogant arrival. Stroking her hair, he praises Padma and her patients for bravely driving the conspirators back and completely turning the tables on their enemies. He confidently notes that even Viscount Roosevelt has abandoned Harrison to side with them, leaving their enemies seething with absolute frustration. Mentally picturing Harrison's furious face, she silently wonders if she should warn Edward about the highly suspicious tree root letter she uncovered. Leaning her head against his chest, she confesses that his unwavering protection brought her immense relief and repeats her heartfelt thanks. Gazing affectionately into her eyes, Edward insists she does not need to thank him, but she stubbornly maintains she had to acknowledge his steadfast support. She silently reflects on the grim reality that the entire ugly confrontation would never have happened if Fisher hadn't arrogantly tried to stop her medical examinations in the first place. Looking at him with deep sincerity, she softly thanks him for everything he has done. Accepting her gratitude, Edward leans in and asks if she will allow him to stay close for just a little while because he is completely exhausted from gathering information. Wrapping his arms around her in a tender embrace, Edward holds her close while her heart pounds wildly in her chest. Staring blankly ahead while held in his arms, she is haunted by the solemn realization that someday she will have to leave this body behind. She ponders the inevitable future, knowing that once the threat disappears, the true Padma buried deep within her heart will finally resurface. Filled with existential dread, she wonders if she will simply return to her own time and what will ultimately happen to her when that day comes. Resting her head against his shoulder, she realizes that once the real Padma reclaims this body, she will no longer be subjected to his biting remarks or complaints. A heavy sorrow settles over her as she concludes that nurturing her growing feelings for Edward is completely meaningless since he will never even thank her true self. Her melancholic thoughts are suddenly shattered when a familiar voice calls out her name from the doorway. Startled by the intrusion, she pulls away from Edward and stammers in shock as her father enters the room looking for her. Her father approaches calmly, mentioning that he had been wondering where she disappeared to after all the noisy commotion outside. Apologizing for the trouble, she is surprised when her father gently reassures her that it is all right and suggests she actually should have said even more to those arrogant men. His expression darkening with concern, her father warns her to be careful because those traditionalist doctors will not easily loosen their grip on power. Nodding with fierce determination, she confidently agrees to heed his warning and stay vigilant. Noticing the lingering romantic tension in the room, her father intentionally clears his throat to awkwardly interrupt the moment. Flustered and blushing furiously, she turns to her father as he dryly asks her to tell the crown prince to finally come out of hiding and get back to his duties. The very next day, she listens as someone amusedly remarks that her habit of angering influential figures at parties is incredibly typical of her. Looking down seriously at the strange root in her hands, she silently wonders if Oscar would be able to identify the mysterious plant. Approaching the relaxed young man by the window, she calls out Oscar's name to catch his attention. Presenting the dried root wrapped in a cloth, she asks Oscar directly if he recognizes what the item is. Oscar carefully inspects the root against the light and immediately identifies the sinister plant as belladonna. She recalls that belladonna is famously used as ladies' eye drops to dilate pupils, But Oscar corrects her, noting that such cosmetic use only applies to the leaf extract. Holding the dangerous specimen up, Oscar gravely explains that this is the root, which is incredibly poisonous. Warning her not to touch it unless absolutely necessary, Oscar states that even this small amount is an absolutely lethal dose. Staring at the deadly root in pure horror, she clutches her chest as the terrifying reality of the situation finally sets in. Her mind races with dark implications as she repeats the phrase about a lethal dose in stunned disbelief. Trembling with fear, she wonders if the original Padma was secretly instructed to use this deadly poison on someone. The pieces terrifyingly click together as she realizes that the mysterious package Padma received from Harrison was undoubtedly this lethal belladonna root. Gripped by a sudden panic, she questions if the original Padma was actually ordered to assassinate Edward by poisoning him. Looking back on Edward's initial wariness toward Padma, she finally understands his suspicion but is left completely confused as to why the original Padma would have wanted to help him in the end. Aisha is deeply puzzled by how Padma managed to join the Royal Medical Corps in an era where bias and severe discrimination from male doctors like Lord Fisher ran rampant. She notes that women's status remained extremely low even among the privileged nobility. She concludes that a 16-year-old girl could never carve out a path in such a male-dominated society relying on knowledge and lineage alone. Recalling Harrison's chilling complaint about her tardiness in carrying out his orders, a terrifying realization begins to dawn on her. Swallowing hard, she wonders with mounting dread if the real Padma made a dark deal with Harrison just to enter the medical corps. Realizing the entire medical corps is completely loyal to Harrison, she deduces that allowing a woman to join was only possible in exchange for administering the poison. She pieces together that Edward's historical death from illness was a cover-up, as Padma's public declarations of his sickness allowed the corrupt medical corps to easily classify as suspicious poisoning as a natural death. The horrifying truth finally solidifies in her mind that Edward's fatal illness was nothing but a meticulously crafted lie. Remembering Edward's heartfelt love letters and the profound sorrow in his voice when he thought he was betrayed, she realizes the two of them were genuinely in a deep romantic relationship. She understands that despite Padma's pure aspiration to become a doctor, the young girl was trapped by a preordained path to become the crown prince's wife that she could not refuse on her own. Exploiting her vulnerability, Harrison must have approached the trapped girl and deceptively gained her trust with honeyed words. Succumbing to the manipulative sweet talk, Padma tragically entered the Royal Medical Corps at the steep price of agreeing to poison her beloved Edward. She finally grasps why the king chose a supporter's daughter as Edward's bride, realizing Harrison used Padma to infiltrate their inner circle out of fear that his treasonous secrets might leak. The grim historical timeline dictates that following Edward's assassination, Harrison would immediately proclaim himself crown prince and seize absolute power. She realizes Harrison's historical refusal to negotiate prisoner releases was actually a calculated move to eliminate Padma since she knew his dark secret. The real Padma eventually realized the devastating truth that she had been completely deceived and used as a pawn. Recalling her recent confrontation with Harrison over the massive amount of poison, she confirms that he handed her a definitively lethal dose. She theorizes that while the original Padma might not have been explicitly ordered to commit murder at first, she was ultimately handed a fatal dose to finish the job. The absolute certainty washes over her that Edward did not die of a tragic illness, but was instead brutally murdered. She remembers that it was Padma herself who publicly declared the crown prince was showing signs of illness so she could stay by his side and monitor him. Once trapped inside the crown prince's palace, the doomed girl had no choice left but to administer the poison without any hope of leaving. She understands that confessing the assassination plot to Thomas would have disastrously brought Harrison's wrath down upon the entire Cavendish family. Even if Padma had tried to expose Harrison's orders, she lacked any concrete proof because his letters contained no sender and no explicit commands to assassinate. Furthermore, attempting to blow the whistle would have undoubtedly caused Harrison and his powerful allies to immediately target her life. Cornered by the ruthless political machinery, the original Padma truly had no means of escape. Aisha's heart breaks for the historical figure who was cruelly deceived, exploited, and forced into committing such a dreadful act. Flashing back to the terrorist attack in her own timeline, she remembers her desperate desire to help people and her agonizing regret over dying before becoming useful. Her dying thoughts echoed with a profound sorrow over failing to save anyone at all. In those final, terrifying moments, she silently pleaded for someone to save her from a meaningless death. Merging her own past despair with Padma's tragic fate, She fiercely resolves that she cannot allow this cycle of tragedy to continue. Staring wide-eyed in absolute shock, she finally realizes with terrifying certainty that the agonizing cry she heard in her memories was truly the original Padma's scream. Gazing solemnly out the dark window with a flickering candle in hand, she silently processes the horrifying revelation of her displaced soul. Clenching her trembling fist against the windowsill, she deduces that eliminating the sinister political threat of Harrison will surely allow the real Padma to awaken and reclaim her body. She envisions a hopeful, victorious future where Edward rightfully becomes king with the true Padma standing proudly by his side. Her eyes narrow with fierce determination as she steels her resolve to secure that triumphant destiny for them both. Gripping her dress tightly, she accepts her profound new purpose and realizes she was specifically summoned to this era to change their tragic fate. The scene shifts to the royal bedchamber where a cheerful Padma greets King Owen and gently asks how the silent monarch is feeling today. Preparing her modern medical equipment, she warmly informs the resting king that she will be administering his intravenous drip again today. A quiet narration reveals that exactly 5 days have peacefully passed since the chaotic and intense medical confrontation at the night banquet. During this time, Edward officially leveraged his royal authority to assign Padma full charge of the king's revolutionary intravenous treatment. Strangely, Harrison's royal guards and the stubbornly traditional court physicians have completely ignored the medical takeover without launching a single intervention. Watching the gossiping nobles in her mind, she realizes this tense medical standoff has caused the true allegiances of every political faction within the palace to become glaringly clear. She silently ponders the precarious political balance and wonders which royal brother the divided court will ultimately choose to support. Observing the king's restful face, she notes his stable condition and hopes he will soon regain the crucial physiological ability to swallow on his own. She smiles with genuine medical pride as she observes that the continuous intravenous fluids have already successfully cured the severe dryness of his lips and skin. Leaning over the grand bed, she gently warns the paralyzed king that he will feel a slight prick before she proceeds with the daily treatment. With expert precision, she carefully inserts the hollow metal needle directly into the royal patient's prominent vein to deliver the life-saving saline. As she adjusts the flow, the eccentric inventor Oscar cheerfully remarks to the king about the incredibly lovely weather outside the palace windows. Oscar warmly recounts his past life in the Lake District, nostalgically describing the long, pleasant outings and outdoor meals his family enjoyed on sunny days. Laughing heartily, Oscar mimics begging the busy crown prince to join them outside, only to be predictably shut down by Edward's relentless work ethic. Glancing at the king's relaxed expression, Padma happily notes that the silent monarch genuinely seems to be enjoying Oscar's lively and theatrical storytelling. Oscar admits the difficulty of carrying a one-sided conversation before casually revealing that the workaholic crown prince is surprisingly still stuck inside the palace managing state affairs. While praising Edward's quick wit and political dedication, Oscar diligently monitors the intravenous drip to ensure the saline fluid is flowing perfectly. Padma smiles warmly, immensely grateful that Edward pragmatically prioritizes true medical hygiene over the kingdom's restrictive and dangerous religious superstitions. Looking up from her detailed medical notes, she eagerly points out that Edward was also the visionary royal who boldly proposed providing modern medical treatment to commoners. A flashback to the bustling capital streets highlights the corrupt Margot family's immense influence and the critical need for Edward to win over the common people's hearts to secure his throne. Holding her quill pen thoughtfully, she deeply admires Edward's groundbreaking plan to establish a royal clinic offering free treatment to absolutely everyone regardless of their social class. Oscar suddenly praises Edward for finding such a wonderfully brilliant wife, causing a highly flustered Padma to freeze in absolute embarrassment over the bold statement. Leaning over the king with a teasing grin, Oscar playfully describes Padma as a beautiful, kind, and strong-willed woman while she panics frantically in the background. Delivering a boisterous and heartwarming final remark, Oscar boldly declares that the king has absolutely no right to die before he meets his future royal grandchildren. Flustered by his sudden closeness, she stammers awkwardly as she tries to find the right words to respond. Reminded that they are not married yet by a teasing onlooker calling them a shy couple, she solemnly reflects that the real Padma hasn't surfaced since that fateful day. Suddenly, a panicked guard bursts through the doors screaming that there is an emergency. Begging forgiveness for the sudden intrusion, the breathless guard announces he has an urgent report specifically for Lady Padma. The frantic guard reports that the crown prince has lost consciousness and the court physicians have been summoned while servants noted Padma's presence. Reassuring her companion that she is fine, she steadies herself as a wave of shock washes over her. Her mind races with horrific historical parallels, wondering if Harrison's allies triggered the dreaded pathological death that could leave the victim bedridden for months. She begins to terrifiedly question if her active attempts to alter the future are causing history itself to unpredictably shift against her. Desperate to locate the Crown Prince, she demands his whereabouts and frantically follows the guard offering to guide her. Her companion faithfully promises to stay behind and guard the king so she can rush to the prince's aid without any worry. Assuring her that he will handle the ongoing treatment safely, he vows to carefully remove the foreneedle once the fluids finish. Flashing a reassuring smile, he promises to open the window and call for help if anything goes wrong, warmly insisting she must not worry. Sprinting through the palace halls, the guard urgently leads the way while warning her that the crown prince's breathing is dangerously labored. The guard quickly explains that the prince had isolated himself in the library to concentrate on documents and securely locked the door from the inside. Interrogating the guard about the exact timeline, she questions if the collapse could merely be heatstroke since it had been sunny all morning. Startled by his nervous reaction, she presses to know if the room was actually hot while the guard stammers that they went to fetch her almost immediately. Pressing for more specific details about the environment, she interrogates him on whether he truly sensed something wrong or felt heat when he opened the door. Stopping dead in her tracks outside, she catches the guard in a critical lie as he nervously admits he doesn't actually remember the room being hot. Panting heavily as she connects the dots, she realizes Edward's recent good health makes heatstroke impossible and chillingly suspects foul play or poisoning. The panicking guard tries to hastily backtrack and loudly claim it was hot, but his unconvincing stammers confirm her worst suspicions that he is lying. Glancing up at the ominous and isolated tower looming above them, she remembers the overwhelming sense of dread she felt the very first time she saw it. Pausing at the dark threshold, she sharply questions if Edward truly collapsed in such a remote and highly suspicious location. Her survival instincts instantly kick in and she violently orders herself to run before the trap can fully spring. Before she can escape, a man viciously grabs her from behind while she struggles furiously and angrily demands to be released. A second assailant presses a cold blade directly against her throat, sadistically warning her not to move or she will die easily. The cold-blooded assassins calmly debate how to expertly slit her carotid artery to fake a hesitation wound without arousing suspicion during the inevitable autopsy. Terrified by their calculated discussion about staging her murder, she realizes the brutal and imminent reality of their plan. Smirking confidently, the guards confirm that the rest of the corrupt cover-up will be easily left to the medical doctors. Trembling in the tight grip of her captors, the horrifying truth crashes over her that Edward was never the target, it was always Padma. Shoving her ruthlessly forward into the shadows, the treacherous guards force their hostage toward her intended execution. Paralyzed by a sudden vision, Aisha realizes she is experiencing the original Padma's memories of meeting Harrison in secret. A stern command to sit down violently yanks her back to the present reality. Staring up in shock, she finds herself face to face with the imposing Lord Fisher. Lord Fisher sneers that the Crown Prince will join her soon, prompting her to frantically demand to know Edward's whereabouts and if his collapse was just a lie. Clinging to the word, soon, she internally realizes with a surge of desperate hope that they haven't actually killed Edward yet. Lord Fisher violently grabs her and forces a pen into her hand, ordering her to write his exact dictated words. Her eyes widen in pure horror as he coldly orders her to write a suicide note confessing to a fatal medical failure. Refusing to accept the fabricated guilt, she gasps as a sudden, terrifying realization strikes her mind. She realizes with absolute clarity that the conspirators are planning to slip a lethal poison directly into the king's foredrip. Panic surges through her veins as she realizes that if the king is murdered, the brilliant inventor Oscar Murphy is also in grave danger. Struggling against her captors, she cries out for her allies as the ruthless guards attempt to force her to pen the fabricated suicide note. Suddenly, thick plumes of mysterious smoke billow into the room, throwing the panicked guards into absolute chaos. As blinding flashes tear through the suffocating smoke, the bewildered conspirators scream in agony as they are systematically struck down. A familiar, cheerful voice cuts through the smoke, marveling at the terrifying reality of royal secret rooms. Stepping out of the haze, Edward calmly explains that the room's current occupants prove it no longer truly belongs to the royal family. Surveying the scene with icy disdain, the prince notes that the room is far too shabby for his future bride. Edward's eyes narrow into a deadly glare as he ponders exactly who dared to drag his fiancée into this dungeon. Coughing through the residual smoke, Padma cries out in overwhelming relief as she spots her saviors. Examining her battered state, Edward's fury visibly mounts at the realization that she was violently dragged and injured. Oscar casually remarks on the smell of gunpowder while cheerfully noting that a lady should always be treated gently. Slamming his sword hilt against the wall, Edward demands a swift and absolute answer from the trembling conspirators. With murder in his eyes, the prince furiously demands to know exactly who laid their hands on Padma. Lord Fisher and his accomplices sweat profusely, paralyzed by the overwhelming, lethal aura radiating from the crown prince. Oscar awkwardly attempts to de-escalate the explosive situation, gently urging the seething prince to calm down and look at him. Determining that their silence equals absolute guilt, Edward coldly pronounces their punishment while the conspirators desperately plead for their lives. Without a shred of mercy, Lord Fisher shrieks a desperate order for his remaining men to kill the intruders immediately. The room instantly erupts into a deadly blur of flashing steel as Edward ruthlessly cuts down the charging guards. Crouching down beside the traumatized girl, Oscar gently checks to ensure she is unharmed in the aftermath of the brutal skirmish. Sensing her deepest fears, Oscar quickly reassures a stunned Padma that King Owen is perfectly safe. Oscar grimly explains that armed knights stormed the king's chambers right after she left, attempting to poison the four-drip and kill him as well. Smiling triumphantly while holding a small glass bottle, Padma explains that she escaped by throwing tear gas directly into their faces. When a bewildered Oscar questions the safety of using such a dangerous substance on faces, she smoothly replies that she kept it strictly for self-defense after her previous capture by the church. Looking down at the incapacitated guards, Oscar mentions he realized the men were definitely being deceived and decided he had to intervene. He casually explains that he brought fireworks just to play with due to the nice weather and simply threw them out the window to cause a massive distraction. He recounts how a furious Edward suddenly stormed into the bedroom, violently shouting at him for causing such a chaotic explosion. Oscar reveals that after searching everywhere without success, he told the frantic prince that she had been kidnapped and deduced the isolated tower was the only place left to look. Arriving at the secluded tower, they were instantly filled with dread when a quick glance revealed she was nowhere to be found. Treating the kidnappers like pests, Oscar happily explains that he pumped thick white smoke into the room to forcefully flush them out of hiding. Outside the tower, a frantic enemy nobleman sweats in sheer panic and violently orders his men to quickly eliminate the intruders. The sinister nobleman glares sharply, bitterly realizing that his idiotic accomplice might already be trying to flee the disastrous scene. Meanwhile, a chaotic scuffle breaks out as Oscar aggressively beats down a terrified guard who desperately begs him to stay away. Inside the smoky room, a bound Padma watches helplessly as Edward fiercely strikes down a hostile guard to protect her. The intense battle suddenly escalates as someone violently lunges forward and a desperate scream to stop echoes through the hall. Padma screams his name in absolute horror as a cruel blade violently slashes across Edward's chest and sends blood spraying into the air. Her traumatized mind flashes back to a peaceful moment where she nervously declined Edward's warm invitation to go horseback riding together because she did not know how. Staring at the memory of his gentle understanding, she desperately asks herself why this specific memory is flashing before her eyes right now. She watches the memory of him reassuringly promising to let her ride with him, deeply confused as to why she is recalling such a tender moment amidst the chaos. The peaceful illusion shatters instantly as reality snaps back to the horrific sight of Edward taking a devastating blade strike. Clenching his jaw in immense agony, Edward releases a strained grunt as dark blood violently erupts from his severe collarbone wound. Despite the massive, agonizing injury, the crown prince fiercely grips his sword handle and refuses to instantly collapse. Blood spills across the stone floor as Edward violently collapses backward while Padma desperately screams out to ask if he is all right. A terrified ally frantically catches the falling prince, screaming out for his highness as the devastating reality of the lethal strike sets in. Dropping to the floor, a hyperventilating Padma pulls his bleeding head into her lap while he struggles painfully to breathe. Suppressing her mounting panic, she tears open his blood-soaked collar and firmly declares she must immediately check the condition of his wound. Tearing the fabric away exposes a deep, horrifying laceration across his collarbone that continuously and violently pumps fresh blood. Her trembling hands become instantly drenched in his warm blood, causing her to freeze in sheer, paralyzing terror. Her medical instincts violently kick in as she realizes she must apply immediate pressure to stop the arterial bleeding, agonizing over the complete lack of blood transfusions, antibiotics, and stimulants in this era. While an ally desperately demands a medical update, Padma stares down at the horrific wound and mentally concludes his condition is incredibly critical. Surrounded by a terrifying puddle of spreading blood, the grim, absolute certainty slams into her mind that Edward is going to die. Tears streaming down her face, she screams frantically for absolutely anyone to come help and save his rapidly fading life. Looking at the gravely injured prince, she screams in absolute terror that Edward is going to die. Desperate for a miracle, she cries out for someone to help them before it is too late. Tears streaming down her face, a mysterious voice suddenly calls out to Aisha in the darkness. Plunging into a strange spiritual void, Aisha is confronted by a ghostly apparition of a woman who looks remarkably like herself. The ethereal woman reminds her that Edward is her true hope for the future and insists she must be the one to save him. Overwhelmed by panic, Aisha begs the apparition to trade places with her and take over the crushing burden. Refusing the desperate plea, the ghostly figure firmly declares that Aisha alone possesses the power to save and protect the prince. The phantom tragically confesses that she tried to lead the world down a different path but made a fatal mistake. Gently touching Aisha's tear-stained face, the spirit desperately pleads with her to succeed where she failed. Aisha stares in pure shock as the woman reveals she is actually a future version of herself. Comforting the terrified girl, the future Padma promises that as long as Edward remains by her side, everything will be fine. The apparition gently reminds Aisha of her fundamental resolve to change the corrupt world alongside the crown prince. Feeling her courage reignite, Aisha accepts the heavy burden and confirms her ultimate decision. With burning determination, she vows to rewrite destiny and change the tragic fate of their world. Snapping abruptly back to brutal reality, Padma furiously orders Oscar to fetch a cloth immediately. While Oscar scrambles to find supplies, she lunges forward to apply desperate pressure to Edward's severed artery. Gripping his bloodied form, she screams his name and fiercely promises that he will survive. Staring down at his pale face, she swears a solemn oath that she will never let death claim him. She anchors her unwavering resolve on the undeniable certainty that Edward must live to become the future king. Sometime later, she watches anxiously over Edward's bandaged body and gasps softly as he finally stirs. Slowly opening his heavy eyelids, the wounded prince weakly calls out Padma's name. She quickly leans in and gently warns him not to struggle because his left arm is completely immobilized. Explaining his severe injuries, she details how she stitched his lethal wound and fixed his broken collarbone to ensure proper healing. As she carefully checks his temperature, the disoriented prince groggily asks how much time he lost to the darkness. She softly informs him that he has been unconscious for nearly an entire day. Relieved by his stable vitals, she assures him the bleeding is managed and the anesthetics will successfully control his agonizing pain. Edward stares silently at his devoted savior, slowly processing the immense effort she exerted to keep him alive. Realizing she hasn't rested at all, he quietly asks if she stayed faithfully by his side through the entire grueling ordeal. Settling back into her chair by the bed, she looks down at him with a heavy mixture of immense relief and lingering fear. When he notices her intense gaze, she admits there is something vital she needs to tell him now that he is finally awake. Leaning aggressively over the injured prince, a furious Padma demands his full attention. She violently shatters the tense silence by screaming at the bewildered prince for acting like an absolute idiot. Edward stares back in wide-eyed shock as her sudden outburst catches him completely off guard. Trembling with residual fear, she furiously scolds him for attempting such incredibly dangerous stunts without thinking. She sharply reminds him that he could have easily died, emphasizing just how lucky they are that his injuries weren't fatal. Gripping his face with both hands, she desperately demands to know if he truly comprehends the sheer weight of his position as the crown prince. Tears stream down her flushed cheeks as she brokenly begs him not to throw his precious life away so easily. Overwhelmed by emotion, she commands him to never take such risks again because he is destined to become the future king. Softened by her genuine tears, Edward gently touches her hand and solemnly promises to never do anything dangerous again. Sitting up slightly against his pillows, the prince shifts the mood by stating there is one specific question he needs to ask her. Confused by his serious tone, Padma nervously wonders if he is going to ask about his wound or its healing time. Staring intensely into her eyes, Edward questions exactly when she developed this sudden desire for him to become king. He drops a conversational bombshell by outright asking if she hadn't originally wished for Harrison to take the throne instead. Padma freezes in stunned silence as the sheer weight of his unexpected accusation crashes down on her. Refusing to let the subject drop, Edward presses forward and calmly asks why she would ever think he believed otherwise. A heavy silence fills the room as his sharp gaze pins her in place, demanding the absolute truth. Reflecting on their fractured past, Edward reveals he became utterly convinced she was working for Harrison the moment she joined the Samidan Medical Corps. He explains that while Thomas is an incredibly capable man, the older doctor remains completely blind when it comes to his own daughter. Acknowledging her lifelong dream of practicing medicine, the prince recalls explicitly asking Thomas if he had discussed her future aspirations with her. Edward reasoned that officially marrying him would have forced Padma to completely abandon her cherished dream of becoming a physician. Anxious to hear the rest of the story, Padma desperately asks what her father actually said in response to that inquiry. The prince turns his gaze toward the ceiling, mentally recalling the painful conversation with her fiercely protective father. He recounts Thomas firmly declaring that abandoning the engagement was impossible because Padma supposedly wished to marry the crown prince from the bottom of her heart. Highlighting the glaring contradiction, Edward points out that she actively avoided him and clearly despised their engagement during those years. He dismisses Thomas's naive excuse that she was merely shy, noting that they used to interact far more frequently when they were children. Turning his attention to her medical career, the prince outright rejects the idea that she was recruited for her competence since the entire medical corps answers exclusively to Harrison. Staring coldly at her, he admits he logically concluded that she must have struck a dark political deal with his rival. He lays bare his original assumption that she had explicitly agreed to work against him in exchange for a coveted position among the physicians. Calling her previous actions ridiculous, Edward reveals he knew his own body perfectly well while she actively spread rumors that he was showing signs of fatal illness. He concludes his deduction by stating she used those very rumors to force her way into his wing, only to miraculously transform into a completely different person afterward. Confronting her with intense scrutiny, Edward points out her past suspicion of Harrison and her explicit desire for him to become king. He coldly deduces that her vast medical knowledge far surpasses that of the traditional royal physician Thomas, who merely follows outdated textbooks. Leaning in sharply, the prince challenges her fabricated backstory by demanding to know how a mere medical trainee could possibly execute such revolutionary techniques. Systematically dismantling her disguise, he vividly recounts how the real Padma was completely fearless of thunder and highly skilled at horseback riding. Edward locks his piercing, unyielding gaze directly onto her trembling form as he corners her with inescapable logic. Breaking the heavy silence, he coldly and directly demands to know who is truly residing inside her body. The terrifying question hangs in the tense air as the overwhelming weight of her massive secret finally crashes down upon her. Trembling under his intense scrutiny, her mind races in pure panic as she desperately wonders how long he has actually known the truth. A sickening wave of dread washes over her as she realizes the crown prince has been quietly observing her every single move this entire time. Overwhelmed by the sheer exhaustion of her heavy lies, tears well up in her eyes as her carefully constructed facade completely shatters. Clenching her fists in desperate resolve, she silently agonizes over her overwhelming desire to finally confess everything to him completely honestly. Her mind spirals with chaotic explanations, wondering if she should claim to be a reincarnation or a time traveler from the distant future. She horribly realizes that telling the complete truth means confessing his imminent death and the devastating centuries of war caused by the Margot family. A profound sadness grips her fragile heart as she accepts that saving his life ultimately means she must disappear from this world entirely. Biting her lip to hold back her desperate sobs, she violently rejects the idea of speaking out loud because she refuses to tell him he is destined to die. Gripped by a paralyzing fear of altering fate, she worries that speaking the grim prophecy aloud might somehow make the tragic future completely unavoidable. Slicing through her spiraling panic, a heavily bandaged Edward gently reaches out and assures her that he only needs her exactly as she is right now. Looking deep into her tearful eyes, he softly asks if she still wants him to claim the throne, prompting her to desperately confirm her unwavering support. Flashing a gentle, reassuring smile, the wounded prince firmly commands her to remain faithfully by his side. Wiping away her lingering tears, a fierce determination ignites in her chest as she absolutely promises to stand with him. Mentally steeling her resolve, she vows to protect his life and alter the tragic history of the entire nation until the crown is securely placed upon his head. She envisions a peaceful, prosperous kingdom completely freed from Harrison's sinister cruelty and justly ruled by a wise King Edward. Despite the beautiful vision of the future, a bittersweet sorrow anchors her as she acknowledges her own inevitable disappearance once her mission is complete. Closing her eyes in quiet resignation, she accepts that the heartbreaking day of their final farewell is rapidly approaching. Pushing aside her looming grief, she fiercely recommits to her singular, vital purpose of ensuring his royal ascension. Sometime later, a deeply relieved Oscar stretches his arms cheerfully and expresses immense gratitude that the prince's severe injury healed so rapidly. Fully recovered and standing tall, Edward confidently discusses political matters with his loyal, gathering supporters in the sunlit corridor. Watching him effortlessly command the room, she nostalgically remembers how devastatingly isolated he was when she first arrived at the grand estate. Shifting into her professional medical demeanor, Padma quietly asks Oscar if the prince's severely fractured collarbone has set properly. Oscar confidently explains the anatomy of the clavicle acting as a protective cushion, assuring her that the worst is entirely over and a full recovery is merely a matter of time. Just 3 days after the injury, Edward declared his right hand was fine and returned to work, cementing his image as a strong crown prince unyielding to violence or pressure. A group of nobles and attendants gather in the grand halls, whispering among themselves as they observe the aftermath of the recent events. Aisha realizes that, ultimately, the entire ordeal was dismissed as nothing more than petty harassment orchestrated by Fisher. The official narrative hastily concluded that the kidnapping was merely driven by Fisher's personal jealousy toward Padma. The widely circulated truth claimed Fisher hired mercenaries to kill her because he resented that a woman had earned the patient's trust and conducted the king's examination over the royal physicians' heads. However, an investigator expresses sheer disbelief that Ed personally killed the knights at the scene, thinking such a feat was entirely impossible. A bound mercenary confesses he only took the money and followed orders without knowing any details, leaving Oscar and the authorities with no significant leads. To make matters worse, the captured knights all committed suicide the very next day by stabbing themselves with knives. Shockingly, the investigator announces that Lord Fisher met the exact same gruesome fate. Before he could even be interrogated, Fisher somehow procured an untraceable knife and slit his own carotid artery, despite all weapons having been previously confiscated. A massive pile of spilled coins highlights the fact that there was absolutely no evidence proving Fisher had paid the enormous sum to hire the knights himself. Casting a suspicious glance at the smiling noble, Aisha deduces that the true source of the mercenary money must definitely be the Margot family. Despite her strong suspicions, she internally admits that she has absolutely no concrete proof to accuse them. As they walk through the corridors, someone carefully asks if His Majesty still seems to be holding up all right. Observing the frail King Owen hooked up to medical equipment, Aisha notes that there are severe limits to simply replenishing his fluids with 4 drips. She confides that she has already given Ed an honest medical estimate of exactly how much time King Owen has left to live. Oscar stretches his arms casually and remarks that if Ed could just become king soon, His Majesty would finally be able to rest easy. Gazing out thoughtfully, Aisha reveals that she now spends every single night praying fervently. She nervously calculates that in just 2 short months, Ed will officially turn 20 years old. A dark realization looms over her as she remembers that, in the original timeline, this is the exact year Ed is supposed to die from his illness. Clasping her hands together, she desperately begs the heavens to please let him survive and ascend the throne just like this. Oscar playfully bows and notes that once Ed is king, Padma will become queen, meaning he won't be able to address her so casually anymore. Aisha looks at him in utter surprise, reminding him that he had previously claimed he would run away to the countryside the moment things settled down. Smirking, Oscar admits that staying by her side seems much more fun, playfully adding that she would undoubtedly be in trouble if he weren't around to help. Looking out the window at the sky, Aisha reflects on the title of queen and internally calls out to the real Padma, wondering where she is now. She notes with a tinge of loneliness that the original Padma hasn't appeared again ever since the day she offered her encouragement. Aisha pieces together that when the Margot family loses its influence and Harrison disappears, the real Padma will surely resurface to become Ed's wife. A sudden wave of existential dread washes over her as she questions what will happen to her own self when that moment arrives. She ponders the terrifying possibility of having no physical body of her own left in this future timeline. Staring into the distance, she wonders if her entire consciousness will simply vanish once her purpose is fulfilled. Realizing her time is short, Aisha Red contemplates all the things she must pass on to Padma before she completely disappears. She mentally lists her medical tools, her vast medical knowledge, and the unresolved matter concerning Oscar as crucial inheritances. Looking solemnly at the Crown Prince's back, she realizes there is one final, profound thing to leave behind. Embracing her warmly, he asks her to listen to his beating heart and promises she will live with him when he becomes king. Stunned by the proposal, Aisha Red realizes this life belongs to Padma and steps back to let her live with him. Suddenly, a smug voice interrupts the tender moment as the younger prince mockingly greets his elder brother. Approaching with a feigned innocent smile, the brother mentions he heard about the recent attack by ruffians. He deceptively inquires about the state of the Crown Prince's wounds while maintaining his false concern. Offering a hollow apology for not visiting sooner, the brother excuses himself by citing his busy schedule managing the mess and official accounts. With a thinly veiled threat, he warns the Crown Prince to take care of himself because hidden resentment could be lurking anywhere. Refusing to be intimidated, the Crown Prince boldly declares that the next time he collides with evil, he will wipe it out completely. Scoffing quietly at the warning, the younger brother turns on his heel and excuses himself from the tension-filled corridor. Pausing before he leaves, the brother offers one last backhanded remark about the Crown Prince's growing workload and health. Stopping him in his tracks, the Crown Prince sharply demands to know exactly what his brother means by those words. The Crown Prince reveals his plan to abolish the special trade privileges exclusively granted to the Kingdom of Russia, questioning how such a corrupt law ever passed. Staring down his rivals, he declares an end to their whims, exposing how one bloated family has siphoned the country's wealth for decades. With fierce determination, he orders them to prepare themselves as he vows to mercilessly dismantle their power and return the stolen wealth to the state treasury. Sneering back, the rival challenges him to try, predicting the Crown Prince will eventually come crying and begging when his momentum fails. The rival arrogantly argues that a state cannot be protected without the military power and money obtained solely through foreign seizure and plunder. He warns that relying on old powers and clinging to outdated methods will inevitably cause another state to swallow them whole. Fiercely rebuking him, the Crown Prince counters that mercenary armies will fail when the money dries up, asserting that only people who truly love their country can protect it. He compares their endless cycle of invading countries for plunder to pay slave soldiers to a desperate, thirsty man drinking seawater. Standing tall, he passionately defends the laws they mock as the lifeblood governing the people, insisting that equality and universal rights are essential for a healthy state. He firmly concludes that true leadership is never about recklessly waving power around to intimidate others, leaving his rivals shocked. Cutting through the escalating tension, a sharp command silences the stunned and outmaneuvered opposition. With the argument decisively won, the Crown Prince orders his entourage to move out. As the rival factions part ways, Padma shoots a tense glare at the smirking brother passing by her shoulder. Suddenly, the Crown Prince halts his stride and calls out Padma's name. Turning to face her, he formally requests to use her immense medical knowledge to help build the future foundations of his country. Offering her a place by his side, he gently asks if she will walk with him into this new era. Padma closed her eyes and internally reflected that she was not the real Padma. A man interrupted their moment to announce that the others were waiting for them. Edward reached out his hand to Padma and encouraged her to go together to make history. He confidently declared that history would change. Sitting with a mother and her child, Padma advised them to be extra careful about washing their hands due to recent cases of infectious gastroenteritis. The grateful mother thanked Padma profusely for establishing the clinic, noting that very few doctors were willing to treat such young children. The mother and child waved goodbye as Padma warmly told them to take care of themselves. Watching them leave, Padma smiled and noted that it felt like they had finally gotten back on the right track. Narration revealed that half a year had passed since Lord Fisher's assassination attempt, resulting in the collapse of the corrupt Royal Physicians Association. Stretching her arms, Padma enthusiastically told herself to keep up the good work just as a knock sounded at the door. A nervous man peeked through the door to ask if Her Highness the Crown Princess was present. Padma immediately panicked and asked Oscar if His Majesty's condition had suddenly worsened. Oscar reassured her that the king was fine but relayed an urgent message from Edward demanding that Padma be brought back immediately. Padma politely thanked a colleague who offered to take over her examinations since her royal escorts had arrived. Leaving the clinic in capable hands, Padma entrusted the rest of the work to her colleagues. Pointing at a distinctive sign featuring a woman's silhouette, a man praised the design as really well done. Padma explained she designed the sign so even illiterate people could identify the doctor's gender at a glance, catering to female patients and shy children who might be uncomfortable around male doctors. Looking at another sign combining the royal banner and church wings, the man noted that the design was instantly understandable. Padma happily shared that her easily understandable symbols had been well received as the number of clinics increased. As they rode in a carriage, Padma expressed immense gratitude for the church's effort in building clinics all across the country. The man smirked and remarked that the church did not need their thanks because they had their own calculated motives. He explained that the church was fundamentally sustained by large donations from everyone ranging from poor farmers to wealthy nobles. He pointed out the hypocrisy of high-ranking clergymen wearing luxurious clothes and eating rich food while the church faced recent criticism. Padma listened intently as he recounted how the crown prince shrewdly asked the church to support his fiancée's plan to establish public clinics. He revealed that the crown prince essentially forced the church to use their funds as good publicity, while also abolishing the corrupt recommendation system and standardizing treatment fees. Padma nervously asked about the new buildings and the similar clinics being constructed in rural areas. The man reassured her not to worry about funding running short, quoting Edward's plan to simply rely on generous major donors. He bluntly explained that the crown prince's half-brother was aiming for the throne, prompting his entire family to donate generously to the church to secure his coronation. Confused, Padma asked if there was truly a direct connection between ascending the throne and making massive donations to the church. Gesturing playfully, the man explained that regardless of public opinion, a legitimate king is only recognized when the archbishop personally places the crown upon his head. Realizing that a few donations won't easily sway his stance, Oscar explains that the current archbishop is a childhood friend of the king and supports the crown prince. He notes that the Margot family becomes increasingly irritated the more clinics the church builds because they are the ones constantly being asked to donate. Padma reveals that she initially planned to collect donations only from the nobility, but Ed opposed it, leading to their current arrangement. Oscar smirks, calling this the crown prince's cunning side, which leaves Padma slightly surprised. Looking at the clinic sign, she suddenly realizes that it only represents the royal family and the church. Oscar confirms her thought, pointing out that the Margot family's name doesn't appear anywhere on the establishment. He gleefully explains that since the church doesn't announce individual donors, the public will mistakenly praise the royal family and the church, causing her popularity to skyrocket. Padma realizes in horror that if they had relied strictly on sponsors, the Margot family would have paid but also made sure to advertise their contribution heavily to the public. Oscar notes that Ed is far more composed than expected, adding that he wouldn't have survived in a den crawling with demons otherwise. Remembering that Ed's 20th birthday and a commemorative ceremony are approaching, Padma grimly recalls that historical records state he died of an illness at 20, though he was most likely murdered. Sweating nervously, Padma wonders if Ed is angry because she completely forgot about the outfit coordination meeting and came to the clinic instead, leaving them little time to decide. She breathes a sigh of relief, thinking about how the birthday present she had been worrying about for a while was finally completed yesterday. Oscar suddenly mentions that Prince Harrison was arguing earlier with a delegation from the Caesarland Empire, instantly catching her attention. Padma remembers that in the original history, she was arrested in the Clarion region and beheaded by order of Imperial Princess Mary after Harrison refused to negotiate, leaving her with a bad impression of the Caesarland Empire. Oscar states that Harrison, acting as the captain of the guard, is strictly inspecting their luggage and causing them trouble entering the castle, which complicates Ed's desire to form an alliance with the Caesarland Empire. Spotting the commotion by the castle gate, Padma wonders if the delegation is stuck there because they were carrying something dangerous. She recalls that when she left earlier, the drawbridge had already been lowered. Observing the lavishly dressed but imposing figures, Padma wonders if those are the Caesarland soldiers who came to celebrate Ed's birthday. An escort loudly announces that they have brought Lady Padma to the tense scene. Stepping out of the carriage, Padma asks what topic they wish to discuss, to which a figure replies that she arrived at just the right time. Recognizing the harsh voice, Padma shrinks back in terror and begs the person not to come any closer. She realizes her mistake in thinking the figure was an extremely slender male soldier, noting instead that it is a young woman. Padma notices the woman's red skin and wonders if she suffers from a sensitive complexion. The fierce woman barks at an attendant to step aside, dismissing his concern that the strong sun is damaging her skin. She scoffs aggressively and reiterates that the sun exposure simply doesn't matter to her. Oscar steps in smoothly, noting the strong sunlight and apologizing as he provides shade, playfully calling it an important duty. Padma steps forward defensively, calling the woman's behavior rude and demanding she speak to her directly if she has something to say. Drawing her sword in a flash of anger, the woman threatens to cut her down here and now if she continues to treat her subordinates with contempt. Clapping his hands with a strained smile, Oscar urges everyone to calm down and introduce themselves, clarifying to the woman that Padma is currently the crown prince's fiancée, not yet the princess. As Padma watches in shock, the fierce young woman officially introduces herself as Mary Charlotte Caesarland. Standing tall in a striking uniform, Imperial Princess Mary of the Caesarland Empire is introduced as the very person directly responsible for driving Padma to her death by beheading. Stepping forward with a formal bow, a stern-faced man introduces himself as Hugo Roche, holding the rank of Major General in the army under the princess's command. The Crown Prince formally introduces Padma not only as his fiancée but as a scholar studying medicine and pharmacology who is currently leading reforms, requesting her expert opinion now that introductions are out of the way. Maintaining a sharp, unreadable expression, the princess agrees that Padma's opinion will undoubtedly be extremely valuable. The tension rises as indignation is voiced over a rude, utterly ignorant man having the audacity to claim that the miraculous medicine they brought is merely an explosive. Staring down the visitors, Harrison firmly insists to Her Highness that the substance in the chest is, in fact, an explosive. The Crown Prince questions the accusation as Harrison doubles down, insisting that because the gift is an explosive substance, he refuses to allow the princess into the castle. Gesturing toward the ornate chest, the Crown Prince asks Padma to use her medical expertise to examine its contents and determine exactly what she brought. Peeking into the open chest, Padma lets out a soft sound of confusion as she wonders aloud what the object is. As Padma thoughtfully lifts a glass bottle to examine it against the light, Harrison panics and yells at her not to shake it. Harrison argues that because the liquid is extracted alongside potassium nitrate, a mineral essential for gunpowder, they absolutely cannot allow a group carrying such dangerous materials to enter the royal palace. Refusing to back down, Harrison coldly asserts that this security measure stands even if the visitors are important guests of his brother. Sneering, Harrison asks the guests to return to where they came from despite their trouble traveling disguised as men, accusing them of fabricating a pretext to drive a wedge between Ed and the Caesarland Empire. Continuing his condescending tirade, Harrison mocks the princess by stating her masculine appearance hardly suits her and offers to prepare a place for her to change into a proper dress. Cutting through the disrespect with a sharp glare, the Crown Prince steps in and forcefully commands his brother that he has heard enough. Stepping protectively in front of the princess's entourage, the Crown Prince asks the guests to forgive the delusions of his foolish younger brother, momentarily marveling at the remarkable trust placed in women in this era. Carefully analyzing the bottle, Padma deduces that the liquid is produced during the manufacture of potassium chloride, correctly noting that just because it is extracted alongside potassium nitrate does not automatically make it an explosive. Harrison quickly counters that potassium chloride is mixed with sodium nitrate to make gunpowder, prompting Padma to realize it is a medicinal liquid that genuinely appears during gunpowder experiments. Staring intently at the vial, Padma explains that this liquid is a byproduct of potassium chloride creation which might have some use, but currently, manufacturers have no choice but to dispose of it. Seizing upon her explanation, a smug Harrison triumphantly argues that if it is produced during gunpowder manufacturing, it definitively proves the substance is an explosive as well. Both Padma and the princess immediately and loudly shut down Harrison's flawed logic with a synchronized, resounding shout of denial. Holding up the bottle, Padma firmly clarifies to the ignorant prince that if he is asking whether the liquid ignites or explodes on its own, the answer is an absolute no. Glaring at Harrison, Padma harshly criticizes his extremely shallow thinking and disrespectful speech toward Her Highness, warning him that he needs to slow down and think carefully before he lands himself in serious trouble. Turning her attention back to the princess with a bright smile, Padma correctly guesses that since the liquid is a medicine, it must be dissolved and drunk, earning a delighted confirmation from Her Highness. Bursting with pride, the princess throws her arms open and declares that the substance is a miraculous medicine boasting universal effectiveness. The princess explains that her father, the emperor of the Caesarland Empire, worried for his old ally and entrusted her as his representative to bring this medicine to completely cure the ailing King Owen. Elaborating on the treatment methods, she confirms Padma's guess that it can be dissolved in water, diluted and drunk, or inhaled directly into the lungs as a soothing vapor. Harrison scoffs and calls the claim ridiculous as the princess proudly insists the medicine purifies the body from within and completely cures absolutely any illness. Unimpressed by the grand claims, a smirking Harrison mockingly asks what she means by that, pointing out that only third-rate doctors ever peddle a so-called universal miracle medicine. Leaning in with an arrogant sneer, Harrison condescendingly asks the imperial princess of Caesarland if she doesn't realize she is obviously being deceived. A cynical man sneered that women, especially protected princesses, were easily fooled by mere words. Outraged by the perceived insult to his imperial father, a furious royal demanded that Harrison immediately take back his disrespectful comments. Feeling completely disrespected by the unacceptable rudeness, the angry royal abruptly ordered his entourage to prepare for an immediate departure despite desperate pleas to stay. Padma gasped in surprise as her companion suddenly pulled out a small, mysterious bottle. He casually explained that the purple liquid was a byproduct of gunpowder production that had briefly spread through the streets as a so-called universal medicine. Padma desperately lunged forward to grab the bottle, leaving her companion thoroughly confused by her sudden urgency. Snatching the bottle away, Padma quickly popped the cork open to inspect the mysterious liquid inside. She absolutely astonished the men by correctly identifying the purple liquid as iodine. She quickly clarified that while it was indeed a medicine, it was absolutely not meant to be swallowed. Padma passionately explained that iodine possessed a powerful ability to disinfect wounds and kill harmful germs. She elaborated that beyond preventing infectious diseases and disinfecting wounds, the liquid could also serve as a vital chemical reagent. Intrigued by her immense knowledge, the man curiously asked what exactly the reagent could be used to test. Padma confidently revealed that the iodine could effectively measure the exact amount of vitamin C in a substance. Edward questioned what vitamin C was, prompting Padma to gently explain that it was a crucial component derived from the food they consumed. She detailed how the body absorbed the vitamin from fruits and vegetables to create collagen, which fortified both skin and blood vessels alongside meat proteins. Edward thoughtfully recalled how his maids had always urged him to eat sour fruits and vegetables to maintain healthy skin. Padma noted that the maids must have learned this through practical experience, emphasizing that the vitamin was just as crucial for blood vessels as it was for the skin. She explained her brilliant plan to use the iodine to identify vitamin-rich foods in order to cure the scurvy she had observed in so many sick children at the clinics. When asked if simply eating vegetables was enough, Padma clarified that the specific amount of the vitamin varied greatly between different plants. She passionately argued that using the iodine to make the invisible vitamin visually apparent would finally convince stubborn adults to feed their children the correct amounts. Because the concept of an invisible vitamin was so hard to grasp, she stressed that a visual chemical reaction was exactly what they needed to persuade the public. Edward interrupted to confirm that illnesses caused by this deficiency could indeed be completely cured, realizing they had just stumbled upon incredibly valuable technology. A companion excitedly pointed out that this discovery could save every maritime nation currently suffering from the disease during long sea voyages. Edward correctly identified the notorious maritime illness as scurvy while the foreign royal listened to their exchange in total confusion. Realization dawned on them as they discussed how the scarcity of fresh resupply points during long voyages inevitably led to severe scurvy among the sailors. They grimly recounted the horrifying symptoms of scurvy, ranging from falling teeth and reopening wounds to inevitable heart failure and death. Realizing the immense stakes, Edward intensely asked Padma if the life-saving reagent could truly be manufactured from the purple liquid. Edward immediately ordered her to begin producing the reagent as quickly as possible, a monumental task she cheerfully accepted with Oscar's help. The visiting royal stared in complete shock, muttering that this groundbreaking medical revelation was truly astonishing. He stood utterly amazed, admitting he had heard rumors of the crown princess's medical knowledge but never expected her to personally pioneer something so revolutionary. Reeling in shock, Padma listens as Princess Mary nonchalantly declares that personally leading an army is standard for an imperial princess. Mary severely reprimands Padma for her outrageous rudeness, proudly asserting that her attire perfectly befits her status as the emperor's legitimate daughter. Speaking on behalf of her father, the princess offers sincere thanks for the medicinal liquid and promises to share the completed reagent with their country. An outraged voice interrupts, aggressively demanding to know why she would foolishly help the enemy like this. Stepping in, Ed firmly argues that the suffering of both nations demands they share the solution to advance long-distance maritime navigation. Lowering his eyes, Ed calmly agrees that this strategy truly is dangerous. He gravely warns that because the Caesarland Empire built massive galleon-type sailing ships, their own long-standing monopoly will soon be lost. Extending his hand toward Princess Mary, Ed proposes that their kingdom and the Caesarland Empire walk the path of prosperity together. Smiling brightly, Mary confidently accepts the Crown Prince's offer. Declaring her unwavering resolve, Mary vows to lead them all toward a radiant future. Orders instantly ring out to lower the drawbridge so all units can take their positions and enter the castle immediately. As the heavy structure descends, Oscar excitedly points it out while Padma stares in apprehension. The massive chains clank loudly as the drawbridge finally begins to lower before the gathered delegation. A voice urgently cries out Padma's name. Overwhelmed by the deafening noise, Padma lets out a terrified scream and collapses to the ground. Ed and another companion yell out in sheer panic as the princess loses consciousness. Sometime later, Padma rests peacefully in a grand bed while Ed sits loyally by her side watching over her. Ed gently asks if she is feeling all right now as Padma groggily murmurs his name. When she asks how long she was asleep, he admits he isn't exactly sure but guesses it has been a few hours. Gazing up at him softly, Padma offers her sincere thanks. Taking a warm sip from her teacup, she admits she already knew lowering the drawbridge would be overwhelming. Ed apologizes for failing to warn her about the thunderous noise despite promising to stay by her side. Padma warmly notes that he kept his promise to stay by her side before asking where Princess Mary went. Ed reassures her that the princess and Major Roche entered the city safely and are currently staying in the wing attached to his palace. Gripping her cup tightly, Padma apologizes for causing him so much unnecessary trouble. Ed quickly dismisses her worries, informing her that Princess Mary and Major Roche actually praised her knowledge highly. As Ed turns away and instructs her to get some rest, Padma urgently asks him to wait for just a minute. Sighing that she never listens to his orders to rest, Ed watches as she rummages through a wooden drawer. Padma turns back around to face him, gently clutching a small wrapped package in her hands. She presents the item to him, explaining that she wanted to give him his birthday present early before the chaotic celebration commotion begins. Handing him a neatly wrapped present, Padma receives a warm thank you from Ed. Watching him accept the gift, Padma silently prays that he remains safe and wishes their peaceful days could last forever. As Ed begins pulling the ribbon to open it, Padma panics and desperately yells for him to open it in his room. Padma violently tries to snatch the gift away while repeating her demand, leaving Ed playfully questioning her frantic behavior. Staring down at the package, Ed earnestly notes that this is the very first time he has ever received a birthday present from her. Stunned by his confession, Padma internally wonders if the original Padma had ever bothered giving him anything despite their long engagement. Clutching the box gently, Ed closes his eyes and offers a sincere, heartfelt expression of gratitude. Opening the box to reveal its contents, Ed peers inside and softly notes that it is a necktie. As Padma hides her blushing face in her hands, Ed closely inspects the fabric and recognizes the clumsy embroidery as a lily. Remembering her frantic preparations, Padma recalls how she foolishly agreed to add custom embroidery despite having absolutely no experience with a needle. Mortified by her messy handiwork, Padma hastily apologizes and tells him he can just undo the stitching and throw it away if he hates it. Chuckling softly at her embarrassment, Ed presses the tie to his chest and warmly assures her that he loves seeing a task she isn't perfectly good at. He smiles down at her, admitting that discovering a flaw in her otherwise perfect capabilities actually brings him a great sense of relief. Flustered and defensive, Padma aggressively reaches for the tie to take it apart, but Ed playfully pulls it away while insisting it is better this way. Mid-argument, Ed suddenly cuts off her flustered shouting by softly calling her name. Pulling her into a sudden, warm embrace, he buries his face in her shoulder and thanks her once again. Holding her close, he murmurs into her hair that the deeply personal gift has made him truly happy. Caught completely off guard by his sincerity, Padma freezes as her heart pounds loudly against his chest. Slowly stepping back, Padma gently touches her own shoulder, lingering on the fading warmth of his embrace. Breaking the tender silence, he softly instructs her to get some rest for the busy day ahead. Left alone in the quiet corridor, Padma stares ahead with a complex, melancholic expression. 3 days later, Padma sighs in relief after finally finalizing her dress for Ed's birthday celebration, thankful that her father handled most of the exhausting preparations. As she walks down the grand hallway, a subordinate points her out to Major Roche. Approaching her respectfully, Major Roche asks if she has lost her way in the vast palace. Padma politely explains that she is merely heading to Oscar's laboratory to check on the iodine. The weary Major reveals he got separated from the princess and desperately asks Padma if she has seen her anywhere. Seeing their comically depressed expressions, Padma apologetically informs them that she hasn't seen her since she was indoors the whole time. Roche rationalizes that the cloudy weather minimizes the danger to the princess's sensitive skin, but he resolves to keep searching anyway out of strict duty. Before marching off to search the inner courtyard, Roche politely asks Padma to relay a message if she happens to cross paths with the runaway princess. Just as the guards leave, a nearby door creeps open to reveal the hiding princess, who frantically whispers for Padma to wait. A man asks someone to take a look at a girl, prompting a confused reaction before Oscar quickly shushes her. The young girl sits huddled on the floor with her face buried in her knees in apparent distress. Oscar explains that Major Roche was looking for her and gently asks what is wrong. The girl tearfully explains she asked Oscar to lend her a hiding place for a little while and promises to go back right away. Oscar gently interrupts to introduce Padma as a doctor, prompting Padma to ask if the princess is feeling unwell before requesting to see her arm. The princess hesitates before revealing severe, angry rashes covering both of her exposed forearms. Padma thoughtfully examines the itchy rash while Oscar clarifies that the princess already had it when she arrived and had not touched any laboratory chemicals. The princess explains they moved there to hide because someone claimed the rash would disappear quickly, but a soldier immediately started looking for her. Padma deduces it is not a drug rash from medicine side effects because the symptoms do not appear symmetrically on both sides. The princess denies touching strange plants or having allergies, noting that this always happens at this time of year when she is exposed to the sun. Realization dawns on Padma as she diagnoses the condition as a polymorphic light eruption caused by ultraviolet rays. Padma explains that some people develop hives when exposed to sunlight right before summer begins, leaving the others utterly confused by the medical terminology. The princess laments that she thought it would be fine since it was cloudy, completely ignoring Roche's previous advice to ride in the carriage with a parasol and long sleeves. Pointing upward, Padma gently warns that sunlight easily penetrates both clouds and window glass. Padma kindly advises the princess to be extra careful during this particular time of the year. Her companion leans forward and asks if this painful reaction always happens exactly like this. Padma admits the exact cause is unknown but notes it usually only happens in this season, suggesting they apply cold compresses to ease the itching. She reassures them not to worry because the symptoms should subside quickly and generally disappear entirely as people grow older, prompting the princess to ask if the condition only affects women. Padma confirms the eruption is most common among teenage girls, leading the frustrated princess to bitterly declare she never wanted to be born a woman. The princess turns to Padma and asks if she also feels looked down upon for being a woman despite working as a knowledgeable doctor. She specifically brings up Harrison to emphasize how arrogant men mistreat knowledgeable women. Padma lowers her head and admits that she will not deny feeling the exact same way about women being looked down upon and gaining nothing but loss. Smiling gently, Padma reassures the princess that she is perfectly satisfied with who she is and questions whether being a man would truly be better. The princess looks up with tearful eyes, utterly confused as to how being a woman could ever be satisfying. Padma warmly explains that she wants to remain herself, not simply because she is a woman, but for a much deeper reason. She proudly thinks of His Highness standing tall and confident. Padma reflects on how deeply Edward trusts her exactly as she is now, fully embracing her identity as a woman. Padma explains to the princess that gender discrimination is an entirely different matter and points out that being a man does not guarantee an easier life. She eloquently argues that not everyone excels at the expected masculine traits of decisiveness and leadership, while some people genuinely find appeal in traditionally feminine qualities like obedience. Her companion firmly states that living without an opinion and merely obeying others is the behavior of cowards, questioning if such an existence is truly right for any human being. Padma gently explains that society functions best when people refrain from forcing their views onto others, acknowledging that everyone thinks differently. She emphasizes that the most important thing is realizing that others are not like us, noting that discussion is healthy but condemnation is not. Continuing her thought, she adds that people must understand this to seek a middle ground while respecting each individual's unique personality and heart. Padma agrees with the princess that the world undoubtedly makes life difficult for women, questioning her about her specific role in changing it. She firmly states that becoming a man is not the solution, resolving instead to correct the world's wrongs so that future generations of girls can live more easily. Overwhelmed by her own insecurities, Princess Mary tearfully confesses she wanted to be a man because she hates constantly making everyone anxious about her fragile appearance. While Padma comforts the weeping princess, Oscar steps in to reassure Mary that her soldiers deeply love and respect her just the way she is. Embracing Mary warmly, Padma reminds her that the fact her people worry about her proves she is incredibly precious and holds great value. She urges the tearful princess to hold her head high and be confident, declaring that she has inherent value exactly as she is. As Mary happily accepts the compliment and notes that she doesn't look manly anyway, Padma nervously wonders if speaking to a princess so casually is appropriate. Mary embraces her true self, playfully acknowledging that while having too many eccentric people might be a problem, the world needs at least one person like her. The heavy tension finally lifts as Oscar breaks into loud laughter, leaving Mary flustered but smiling. Later, dressed in formal attire, Ed approaches Padma hesitantly, admitting he doesn't quite know how to express his thoughts. When Padma nervously asks if something is irritating him, Ed bluntly confirms that it is, leaving her to worry that he dislikes her outfit. Internally cursing his attendant Thomas for dressing her so beautifully, Ed quickly changes the subject to confirm that Thomas prepared her dress because she couldn't decide quickly enough. Blushing deeply, Ed finally manages to sincerely compliment Padma, telling her that the dress and accessories suit her perfectly. A flustered Padma returns the compliment, calling him handsome before suddenly noticing something on his outfit. Her eyes widen in shock as she abruptly tells Ed to wait a moment, pointing directly at his chest. Padma realizes in horror that Ed is actually wearing the slightly clumsy, hand-embroidered tie she gave him for his birthday. She frantically demands to know why he would choose to wear such a deeply personal and flawed gift on the day of his massive public celebration. As Padma panics about what others will think if they see it, Oscar playfully chimes in to praise her as a diligent wife. While Padma desperately tries to convince him to take it off, Ed proudly announces to a confused newcomer that Padma gave him the tie. Oscar smirks in realization as he watches the couple bicker playfully in the grand hallway. Princess Mary and Major Roche approach the group, with Mary immediately noticing the tie and remarking that it suits him perfectly. Examining the uneven stitching, Major Roche guesses it is a special dabbly pattern, prompting Mary to ask him to refrain from hasty remarks about what looks like amateur embroidery. Mary quickly covers for Padma, defending the embroidery by pointing out that since Padma is an expert at medical suturing, her stitching technique is completely valid. The conversation is cut short when Mary excitedly announces that her father, the Emperor, is arriving shortly, causing Padma to panic anew over hiding the tie. The Emperor finally arrives and humbly apologizes for his tardiness, officially thanking the Crown Prince for the invitation and the valuable medicine. Ed formally welcomes the Emperor, noting that despite it being his birthday celebration, everyone is captivated by the magnificent Caesarland sailing ship docked outside. The Emperor smiles warmly and admits fault, noting that Caesarland's long maritime voyages are only possible thanks to a special secret possessed by the Kingdom of Dabley. Expressing deep gratitude, Emperor Fernand thanks Padma for curing his daughter's rash and sharing the groundbreaking method to prevent scurvy during long sea voyages. Humbly deflecting the excessive praise, Padma insists her success was only possible because the forward-thinking and courageous Princess Mary was open-minded enough to accept her medical opinions. Blushing softly, Princess Mary interjects that if anyone deserves to be called courageous, it is Crown Prince Edward, who gallantly protected them when a misunderstanding barred them from the castle. Acknowledging that the crisis was resolved smoothly thanks to the wisdom of Edward, Padma, and Oscar, Emperor Fernand listens as the inventor eagerly introduces himself and his technique for measuring vitamin C. Beaming with pride, Oscar explains that they are currently conducting a titration to measure the concentration of vitamin C, praising Padma for her invaluable knowledge of iodine reactions. Impressed by the strategic advantage, Emperor Fernand realizes that supplying naval crews with vitamin C-rich foods during port stops will prevent scurvy and put their nation a step ahead of the rest. Padma passionately adds that spreading the revolutionary concept of vitamins throughout the kingdom will likely drastically reduce the number of children suffering from preventable illnesses. Thoughtfully stroking his beard, Emperor Fernand agrees that widespread education on nutritional science and vitamins will significantly improve the overall health of the nation's children. Reflecting on past tragedies where pellagra forced orphanages to close, the emperor marvels that such devastating diseases can now be prevented simply by consuming the right nutrients during meals. Filled with enthusiastic determination, Princess Mary passionately urges her father to return home immediately so they can begin implementing these life-saving nutritional reforms as quickly as possible. Sighing softly, Emperor Fernand admits he feels a hint of envy toward King Owen, leaving a confused Edward to wonder what is troubling the powerful ruler. Recalling his visit to the bedridden King Owen, the emperor reflects that despite the confusing letterboard communication, the ailing king's peaceful demeanor proves he lives without any regrets. Staring intently at the young couple, the emperor explains that King Owen's peace of mind comes solely from knowing he leaves his legacy in the hands of such a capable crown prince and his exceptional fiancée. Looking down with a heavily conflicted expression, Emperor Fernand quietly mutters his deepest, long-held lament, wishing that his talented daughter Mary had been born a man. Edward boldly interjects, explaining that Mary struggles so fiercely and disguises herself as a man precisely because the people around her constantly repeat that her gender is a burden. Politely asking for forgiveness for his sheer boldness, Edward looks the emperor in the eye and prepares to share a crucial observation despite their recent acquaintance. Gesturing to the guards, Edward points out that the profound, genuine respect Princess Mary commands from her officers is clearly evidenced by Major Roche's deeply sincere attitude toward her. He firmly asserts that her loyal subordinates follow her not because of her gender, but strictly because she is an inherently brave and honest leader. Smiling warmly, Edward explains that Princess Mary is universally loved and respected because everyone can deeply feel that she loves her people more than anything else in the world. Concluding his passionate defense, Edward declares that because she strives so genuinely to be a good ruler for her people, there is absolutely no room left for petty gender discrimination. Smiling in full agreement, Major Roche adds that people willingly follow her without the threat of violence, praising her innate leadership talent and tireless effort. As Mary smiles brightly, Padma confidently chimes in to reinforce the truth that people are ultimately moved by pure passion alone rather than authority, violence, or gender. Blushing furiously, Mary defensively yells at them not to treat her like a child, prompting the emperor to affectionately pat her head while declaring that only Edward is worthy of standing beside such an incredible young woman. Looking at the young prince with deep respect, the emperor solemnly tells Edward that his wonderful encounter with such remarkable individuals is undoubtedly the miraculous work of heaven. Shifting to official matters, Emperor Fernand confirms he received Edward's request to obtain exclusive rights to sell goods brought back from long sea voyages to the Caesarland Empire. Edward confidently confirms the request, specifying with a sharp gaze that he is particularly interested in securing the highly lucrative trade of spices and porcelain. Edward silently calculates that utilizing these exclusive rights will allow him to bypass the Margot family's massive monopoly, flood the market with goods, and ruthlessly drive down prices. Satisfied with their mutually beneficial arrangement, Emperor Fernand politely excuses himself from the gathering to attend a scheduled appointment with an old friend. Watching the emperor walk away, Edward narrows his eyes and silently hopes that the rest of his ambitious political maneuvers will proceed just as smoothly. Meanwhile, a cheerful Mary eagerly asks Oscar for a dance, leaving the flustered inventor to playfully wonder aloud which of them is supposed to take the woman's part in the routine. Smirking confidently, Princess Mary declared she would be the one leading the dance before playfully suggesting they go look for a partner. Edward politely noted he did not mind before turning to ask if his first dance could be with the princess. Addressing the esteemed guests, Edward announced that while he and Padma were originally meant to open the ball, today marked a blessed and successful negotiation for their nation. Gesturing gracefully, Edward turned his attention to ask what Her Highness Mary thought of his proposal. He warmly invited Mary to share the first dance with them to celebrate their newly built relationship of mutual friendship. Mary confidently accepted the invitation with a satisfied hum. She boldly warned them not to blame her if she stole everyone's attention just like her father's enormous ship. Edward extended his hand graciously toward his chosen partner. Gazing into her eyes, he formally asked Padma if he could have this dance. Padma teased the crown prince with a soft laugh, noting that he had kept her waiting for quite a while. The couple locked eyes intimately as they began to sweep across the ballroom floor. Laughter filled the air as Edward spun Padma playfully around the grand hall. The royal couple moved in perfect, elegant harmony under the glowing chandeliers. Oscar smiled warmly as he watched Edward and Padma dance joyfully together. Observing Mary's presence, Padma internally realized with absolute certainty that the future had undeniably changed. She watched the surrounding nobles mingling peacefully in the grand ballroom. Padma reflected in awe that securing friendly relations with the Caesarland Empire was never supposed to be part of the original timeline. Overwhelmed with relief, she whispered her gratitude just before a sudden, disorienting sensation struck her. Her vision violently blurred as her consciousness was abruptly ripped from the ballroom. Finding herself in a dark void, she recognized this strange place as the inside of the original Padma's heart. She frantically called out for Padma, noting that the original soul usually floated quietly in this space like the moon. Panic set in as an unseen force violently pulled her away while she screamed out to ask what was happening. Back in the physical world, Edward desperately caught the collapsing girl while shouting her name. A concerned Oscar scolded her for almost falling while Edward anxiously asked if she had drunk too much. Oscar suddenly paused and narrowed his eyes in suspicious realization. Staring back in utter bewilderment, the girl hesitated before uncertainly asking if the man in front of her was Oscar. She stared wide-eyed at the deeply concerned faces of both Oscar and Edward. Still trying to process the worried questions about drinking, she groggily mumbled their names in utter confusion. A horrifying realization dawned on her as she remembered being completely alone in that inner void. Trembling with shock, she finally understood that she must have physically switched places with the original Padma. Startled and out of breath, Aisha gasps in the middle of the lively celebration while trapped in Padma's body. Leaning in close, Ed softly asks the shivering girl if she is feeling cold. Observing her intense fatigue, Ed notes that the evening banquet is almost over and acknowledges she has been moving non-stop since the morning. Turning to his trusted aide, Ed explains he cannot leave the hall and instructs Oscar to escort Padma to her room instead. Leading her away from the crowded hall, Oscar gently apologizes for frightening her and asks if she is doing all right. As Padma steps out onto the moonlit terrace, Aisha realizes with a jolt that she is completely trapped inside the original host's heart. A strained, hesitant smile crosses her face as she wrestles with the terrifying internal turmoil. Guided by Oscar, she silently walks through the grand archway and leaves the bustling banquet behind. Sinking into her dark thoughts in bed, Aisha wonders what would happen if she were to simply give in and fall asleep like this. She fears that if she surrenders now, she might never wake up again and will permanently switch places with the real Padma. Tossing beneath the covers, she frustratingly realizes she cannot sleep even though she is utterly exhausted from the banquet. She reflects on how securing a connection with Princess Mary has made Dably's invasion of the Caesarland Empire nearly impossible, ensuring a future where Edward successfully becomes king. Staring blankly into the dark, she desperately wonders if the future is already decided and if that is why the original Padma is trying to reclaim her body. A wave of dread washes over her as she questions what will happen to Edward and King Owen if her own existence fades away completely. She nervously recalls that even though King Owen's condition is stable now, a suspiciously large number of people came to check on him tonight. Consumed by anxiety, she questions whether King Owen's impending death will cast a dark shadow over Edward's hard-won future. Clutching her blankets tightly, she admits she is terrified to fall asleep even though she must bid farewell to Princess Mary tomorrow. Seeking a distraction from her racing mind, she decides that drinking something might finally help her calm down and sleep. Peeking cautiously out of her room, she wonders if she can sneak into the kitchen to grab some alcohol. Slipping through the dark corridors, she decides against bringing a light to avoid drawing any unwanted attention. She quietly descends the grand staircase, letting her eyes adjust to the dim, haunting shadows of the castle. Spotting two familiar figures below, she pauses in surprise and wonders what Oscar and Ed are doing out so late. Listening closely from the shadows, she overhears Ed discussing delivery dates and noting that there really are a lot of different types of a certain item. Oscar replies that while there is no fixed deadline, they want to be informed the moment the project is finished. Holding a document, Oscar cheerfully agrees to start on the tasks one by one and mentions he has already finished the work requiring Iodine. Taking a casual sip of his drink, Ed abruptly changes the subject and asks Oscar if he used to be in a theological seminary. Oscar lightly clarifies his background was closer to religious studies and confirms theology was just a required course. Rubbing his neck sheepishly, Oscar admits he isn't very knowledgeable on the subject because he slept through most of the classes. Peering down from the staircase, Aisha freezes as Ed gravely asks Oscar if it is possible for another soul to enter a human body. Brushing off Oscar's panicked question about demonic possession, Ed calmly explains a scenario where a person's outward appearance remains the same but their personality changes completely. Speculating on her strange condition, Padma likens her situation to a demon or spirit possessing a body that exorcists usually deal with. Sitting comfortably on the sofa, Edward recounts to Oscar that most possession cases he has seen were merely people acting. Edward thoughtfully counters that this phenomenon appeared completely without warning and seems like neither acting nor a mental illness. Conceding that the idea sounds like philosophy, Edward logically deduces that theoretically anything could be possible unless explicitly proven otherwise. A sudden realization crosses Edward's face as the pieces of the theoretical puzzle begin falling into place. Noticing his sudden shift in demeanor over a cup of tea, Padma curiously asks him what just occurred to him. Edward gravely states his terrifying theory that things which appear suddenly may also disappear just as suddenly. Stricken by his words, Padma stares into the dark void and terrifiedly wonders where her current consciousness will go if she vanishes. Recalling the brutal tactical shootout of her past life, she frantically questions if she will return to her original, bullet-riddled body. Overwhelmed by the heavy dread of her impending disappearance, Padma weakly slumps her head in the quiet hallway. Sliding slowly down the grand wooden doors, she sits on the floor lost in a wave of deep, isolating despair. She anxiously ponders whether her soul will be confined within the original Padma's heart or if she will simply cease to exist altogether. Accepting her uncertain fate, she realizes she might just surrender everything back to the person it was originally meant to belong to. Shaking off her crippling despair, she fiercely resolves that she must protect Edward's body, thoughts, and future at all costs. Staring warmly at Edward's gentle profile, she views him as a small, resilient light that can never be crushed. She bravely accepts that her eventual disappearance from this timeline will simply mean she has completely and perfectly fulfilled her role. Knowing her time is limited, she resolves to leave a detailed message for the original Padma containing Oscar's medical chemical compounds to save King Owen and protect Edward. Looking at Edward with a renewed sense of unwavering purpose, she prepares herself to silently face whatever the future holds. Clutching her chest tightly, she vows to carry her profound, unyielding love for him with her because she refuses to hand it over to anyone else. Her deep emotional thoughts are suddenly interrupted when Edward unexpectedly opens the door holding a single lit candle. Explaining that he was just drinking with Oscar, a concerned Edward asks her what she is doing lingering in the hallway. Scrambling for a plausible excuse, Padma claims she heard a noise and thought he was still awake from sheer exhaustion. Stepping forward into the dim light, Edward silently hands a small, neatly wrapped box to a very confused Padma. Meeting her surprised gaze, he gently insists that he cannot possibly be the only one receiving a birthday present today. Flashing a warm, affectionate smile, he apologizes for the delay and proudly presents it as her gift for this year. Padma stares at him in stunned silence as the unexpected, deeply heartfelt gesture leaves her completely speechless. Teasing him for his impatience, she playfully points out his hypocrisy in demanding she open it now after he explicitly told everyone else to wait. Opening the delicate box, Padma gasps in pure awe at the breathtakingly beautiful diamond necklace resting inside. Edward thoughtfully explains he chose a necklace because rings and earrings would frustratingly interfere with her medical examinations and stethoscope. Blushing fiercely, Padma looks up at his handsome face and silently wonders if he deliberately chose something she could wear all the time. Holding up her new present, Padma excitedly asked Edward to help her try it on tomorrow, only for him to stop her. Edward playfully scolded her for being the only one daring enough to give orders to the crown prince as she eagerly urged him to put it on her. Fastening the beautiful necklace around her neck, Edward asked if she was finally satisfied with her gift. Padma warmly thanked him while holding the gem, prompting Edward to smile fondly at her joy. Edward gently promised that next year he would make sure to arrive in time for her birthday. Embracing him closely, Padma softly reassured him that his slight delay meant nothing to her. Resting her head against his chest, she silently resolved to practice her embroidery so she could give him a handmade tie next year. Clinging tightly to his embrace, she desperately wished to stay by his side forever without ever being separated. Edward kissed her hair and admitted he was genuinely looking forward to her gift while she playfully accused him of teasing her. Pulling her closer, Edward romantically suggested they give each other presents every single birthday without ever forgetting. Padma smiled blissfully and wished him a happy birthday while eagerly anticipating the years to come. Sometime later, a heavy silence filled the royal bedchamber as everyone gathered around the frail king on his deathbed. The dying monarch struggled for breath as his family and royal officials watched in solemn anticipation. An older official approached the bed with a formal document to confirm the royal succession one last time. The official read aloud that Prince Edward was to be the next generation's crown prince and asked the king to confirm if this was absolutely certain. Summoning his remaining strength, the sickly king slowly and deliberately blinked his eyes. The royal attendees watched with bated breath as the silent confirmation registered across the room. Padma watched in awe, realizing that the single deliberate blink was the king's way of saying yes. Edward desperately cried out to his father as someone urgently called for the letterboard so the king could communicate his final thoughts. A heavy message was spelled out commanding someone to serve their brother well. All eyes immediately shifted to Harrison as the weight of the king's final command settled upon him. With a darkened expression, Harrison coldly acknowledged the decree and declared that the will should be carried out. Padma stared in absolute shock as she realized Edward was truly about to inherit the throne and become king. Shattering the solemn moment, Harrison suspiciously demanded to know if the scribe considered the will legally valid. Edward shot a dangerous glare at his half-brother while Padma watched the rising tension with deep concern. An outraged official demanded to know what Harrison meant by raising such disrespectful doubts right in front of His Majesty. Harrison fiercely doubled down and questioned whether communication through a mere letterboard could even be trusted for something so important. Edward furiously defended his father for fulfilling his royal duty to the very end, completely ignoring Harrison's bitter complaints about fairness. Taking immediate command, Edward ordered Thomas to broadcast his father's death and announce his own ascension to the throne both domestically and abroad. Standing tall beside his father's body, the new king solemnly ordered the capital's mourning bells to be rung for a 3-day period of grief. Archbishop Arthur solemnly announces that he has received King Owen's will and tells Ed that they will discuss the funeral details later. Instructing Count Thompson to coordinate with the Archbishop, Ed reflects that Archbishop Arthur and King Owen were childhood friends. With a somber expression, Ed assures everyone that he will inform them once the funeral arrangements are fully settled. He firmly orders them to remain in the palace and wait for further instructions. Watching him closely, Aisha notes that his lack of specific words and lingering silence is uniquely frightening. The heavy atmosphere of grief fills the royal bedchamber as Ed and Aisha stand solemnly beside the deceased king. A sharp, calculating gaze cuts through the somber mood. As the palace reels from the tragedy, Harrison suddenly makes his move. The ambitious prince completely disappears from sight without leaving a single trace behind. Aisha glances back in quiet apprehension as she attends the formal mourning proceedings. The royal court gathers in the Grand Cathedral to formally mourn the passing of King Owen. Stepping out into the sunlight after the funeral, Aisha gently calls out Ed's name. Slumped quietly in a chair, an exhausted Ed rubs his face in an attempt to stave off the crushing fatigue. Approaching her with heavy steps, Ed apologizes for keeping Aisha waiting. Aisha stares back at him with deep concern etched across her face. A sudden announcement rings out that Lady Padma has arrived, prompting the staff to swiftly finish their daily preparations. Smiling warmly, Oscar takes a rolled document and announces that he will go on ahead. Aisha enters Ed's study and urges him to rest, noting that it has only been 7 days since the funeral. Stubbornly poring over his paperwork, Ed dismisses her concern by stating he can rest whenever he wants. Pressing the issue, Aisha warns him that it will be too late if he simply works until he collapses. Ed stops writing and calls her name softly, breaking the tension between them. Staring at her intensely, Ed drops the bombshell that they still have absolutely no idea where Harrison is. Ed explains that while Harrison's retainers claim he is confined to bed, no one actually knows his location and he is definitely not in the palace. Attempting to ease her fears, Ed reassures her that trusted people are looking for Harrison and will find him soon. Quickly shifting the subject, Ed asks Aisha if she has any plans for the day since she already visited the Royal Capital Clinic. He sternly orders her to always keep guards with her from now on and reveals he plans to hold the coronation ceremony immediately. As Ed casually mentions getting it done before nightfall, a stunned Aisha asks exactly when the coronation is supposed to happen. Meeting her wide-eyed gaze, Ed bluntly declares that the coronation will take place today. Flustered by the sudden urgency, Aisha argues that such a massive event should require inviting neighboring kings. Ed firmly counters that he must conduct a proper coronation immediately to show the entire world that he is the legitimate, undisputed king. Discussing the aftermath of the king's passing, Edward grimly notes that Harrison absolutely refuses to accept the reality of their father's final moments. He warns Padma that they must brace for dangerous interference since Harrison is backed by the enormously wealthy Margot family and the immense military power of Russia. Placing his hand firmly on the documents, Edward bluntly states that the moment the high priest places the crown upon his head, his legitimacy will be unquestionable. Glancing away with a heavy expression, he solemnly adds that it is perhaps a fortunate thing she is not yet officially his wife. Utterly confused by his sudden shift in tone, Padma stammers as he begins explaining the dangerous implications of bringing her along before marriage. Staring at her seriously, Edward explains that the country will plunge into severe instability following his coronation, which will drastically change her social standing. He warns her that her unofficial status makes her incredibly vulnerable to mistreatment or even capture by his political enemies. Cutting off her frantic protests, Edward sternly demands she listen to him until the very end so she understands the gravity of the situation. Hurt and panicked by his cold logic, Padma outright asks if he is trying to break up with her. Standing defensively in the grand room, she accuses him of wanting to annul their engagement simply because becoming his lawful wife would put her in danger. Overwhelmed by swirling emotions, Padma fiercely grabs him by the collar and screams at him not to make such cruel jokes. Tears welling in her eyes, she desperately reminds him of his own solemn promise to show her the world once he took the throne. Edward stares in stunned silence as she passionately declares his undeniable destiny to rule. Refusing to back down, she firmly insists that he is the only one capable of becoming king and changing their entire country for the better. Gripping his hands tightly, she tearfully pleads with him to stand by the vows he previously made to her. Gently cupping her tear-stained face, Edward softly reiterates that marrying him will expose her to very real, terrifying dangers. He gravely warns that anyone harboring hatred toward him could capture her and put her very life at risk. As Padma sheds silent tears of frustration, he tenderly wipes her cheek and urges her to keep listening. Gazing deeply into her eyes, Edward finally reveals that he has absolutely no intention of ever abandoning her. Pulling her close, he asks her to be his queen while vowing to protect her and always keep her by his side no matter what happens. He firmly promises to prepare the highest possible seat for her by placing her on the queen's throne. Burying her face in his chest, a sobbing Padma scolds him for saying such wonderful things in such a terribly confusing manner. Smiling warmly as he embraces her, Edward teasingly blames her for jumping to conclusions instead of letting him finish his completely botched proposal. Sometime later, Edward kneels reverently in his magnificent royal mantle as a beautifully dressed Padma watches the ceremony from afar. The grand cathedral falls utterly silent as the royal coronation ceremony finally commences before the high priest and the assembled nobility. Outside the cathedral, onlookers murmur in disappointment as the evening sun begins to rapidly set. The high priest solemnly addresses Edward Louis Dabley as he prepares to anoint the new ruler. Just as the crown is presented, a miraculous, blinding ray of sunlight abruptly pierces through the cathedral windows to beautifully illuminate the kneeling prince. Padma and the nobles gasp in sheer disbelief as the fading sun seemingly reverses its natural course to shine upon the hall. Whispers of divine right sweep through the awestruck crowd as they proclaim the heavens themselves returned the sun specifically to bless the new crown prince. In a grand ceremony, the archbishop officially crowned Edward in the name of God. The massive crowd erupted into thunderous cheers to celebrate King Edward. Standing tall, the newly crowned king commanded his officials to send out decrees both domestically and abroad while ringing the bells of blessing throughout the capital. Watching the ceremony in awe, Padma wondered what was happening as a brilliant light seemingly gathered around Edward. A quick flashback revealed conspirators eagerly finishing preparations for a secret mechanism before nightfall. The awestruck crowd believed the gods had chosen King Edward, unaware that this incredible miracle was secretly orchestrated using Oscar's light-collecting device. Bathed in the miraculous light, Edward gently called out to Padma. A fond memory surfaced of a surrogate father lamenting that he had to hold his beloved daughter's wedding on the sidelines of a coronation. Despite his weeping heart, he admitted there was no other choice in such an emergency situation. Overcome with emotion, the older man carefully adjusted her veil and begged for the bride to be protected from all harm. A concerned official asked if she was all right, to which the veiled bride politely expressed her gratitude. The official warmly dismissed her thanks, explaining that as a father himself, he deeply sympathized with Count Cavendish's feelings. Reflecting on the monumental event, Padma wondered if this was a true turning point in history as she was guided forward. She realized that even her own mysterious exchange of consciousness was originally just a line in a history that should never have existed. Watching the king stand before her, she felt an unmistakable certainty that history was truly changing. Noting her tears, the older man warmly observed that she had truly become Padma. He teased the crybaby bride for being as emotional as ever while walking down the aisle with her father. Deeply moved, Padma embraced her surrogate father and silently thanked Aisha. Signaling the climax of the ceremony, the priest announced the beginning of the vows. The priest formally asked groom Edward Lewis Dabley if he swore to take Padma Cavendish as his wife. He recited the sacred vows, asking if Edward would love, cherish, and comfort her through sickness, health, joy, and sorrow. Edward swore his vow so immediately that someone playfully complained he should have said it with a bit more feeling. Turning his attention, the priest then addressed Padma Cavendish. He solemnly asked if she swore to support her husband with love through all hardships. A wave of hesitation washed over Padma as she internally questioned for whom she was truly making this vow. Torn between her identity as Aisha and her role as Padma, she agonized over her uncertain future and the terrifying possibility of suddenly disappearing. Sensing her deep distress, Edward gently called her name to bring her back to the present. Tears streamed down her face as she silently accepted that she had no control over when she might vanish from this world. Pushing through her fears with a radiant smile, she finally spoke up and swore her eternal vow. Satisfied with their promises, the priest instructed Edward to lift the veil and exchange the kiss of vows. Edward tenderly gazed down at his beautiful, teary-eyed bride. The royal couple shared a deeply romantic kiss before the magnificent stained glass windows. Observing from afar through a telescope, Oscar cheerfully noted that everything seemed to have gone well before suddenly noticing something amiss. Meanwhile, the royal guards raised their swords in a grand arch to congratulate the newlyweds and wish them eternal happiness. The joyous celebration was abruptly shattered when an exhausted messenger frantically collapsed onto the floor. Panic erupted as the messenger desperately announced that the nation of Russia had issued a formal declaration of war and launched an attack.